Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. I never imagined myself living in a house like this. It was old, ancient, really, and carried a certain charm that only someone like me, desperate for a fresh start, could find appealing. After my divorce, I decided I needed to leave everything behind. The city, the reminders, the suffocating weight of memories. When I found the listing for the house online, it felt like fate. It was affordable, spacious, and in a quiet town where no one knew my name. The day I arrived, the house greeted me with its creaky floorboards and the faint scent of something unplaceable, like damp wood mixed with old paper. The movers set down my boxes, giving me side eyes as they looked around the dimly lit space. "You sure about this place?" one of them asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "It's perfect for me. Perfect because I didn't need perfect. I needed solitude." The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, arranged furniture, and slowly began settling into a routine. The house had quirks I told myself were normal for something its age. The upstairs hallway groaned under my footsteps, and the pipes rattled whenever I turned on the hot water. At night, I'd hear the occasional sound of the wind slipping through cracks in the windows, carrying with it a low, whistling moan. My neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, was the only person who bothered to introduce herself. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an unsettling habit of staring just a little too long. "Not many people stay in that house long," she told me the first time we met. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, I heard it's been on the market for a while." She didn't laugh with me. "Some houses carry weight," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "And some people aren't built to bear it." That night, her words echoed in my mind as I lay in bed. My room was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. Just as I began to drift off, I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced with possibilities. The house settling, an animal in the attic, maybe even my imagination. I waited, straining to hear it again, but the house had fallen silent. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noise, I thought, especially old ones. But the noises continued. Every night, around the same time, I'd hear those footsteps. Sometimes they were slow and deliberate, other times quick and erratic as though someone were pacing. And then there were the smells. The faint odor of damp wood grew stronger, sharper, until it turned sour, like rotting fruit. No matter how many windows I opened or candles I lit, it lingered, clinging to the air like an unwelcome guest. It wasn't until the end of the week that I decided to mention it to Mrs. Caldwell. "Have you ever heard things in your house? I asked, trying to sound casual. Her expression darkened. "It's not my house you should be worried about." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" She hesitated before speaking again. "The house you're in. It's been empty for a reason. People hear things, feel things. You're not the first to ask me about it." "Like what?" Her gaze was steady, unflinching. Footsteps, voices, cold spots. One woman, she ran out in the middle of the night, screaming about shadows watching her from the corners. I laughed nervously, but it came out shaky. "Sounds like a bad case of nerves." Mrs. Caldwell didn't smile. "Maybe. Or maybe some houses are better left alone." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the dark, every sound amplified by the silence. When the footsteps started, I didn't ignore them. I got out of bed, flashlight in hand, and made my way upstairs. The hallway stretched out before me, the floor groaning under my weight. I swept the beam of light from one end to the other. Nothing. But then I felt it. A chill that started at the base of my neck and crept down my spine. The air felt heavier, colder, as though something unseen was standing just inches away. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. But the smell, oh God, the smell. It hit me like a wall. Acrid, sour, suffocating. I gagged, covering my nose and stumbling back toward my bedroom. When I closed the door behind me, I locked it. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. The stress of the move, the isolation, Mrs. Caldwell's unsettling stories, it was enough to make anyone paranoid. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with this house. And whatever it wasn't going to let me leave so easily. The following morning, I tried to shake off the events of the night. I busied myself with unpacking the last of my boxes and rearranging the furniture in the living room, trying to convince myself that everything would feel normal once the house looked more like a home. But the air in the house felt heavier now, as if the walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker in every corner. Even during the day, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see what? I didn't know. It was around noon when I decided to take a break and stepped outside for some fresh air. The sun was warm on my face, a welcome contrast to the cold, stale air inside. Mrs. Caldwell was out in her garden again, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her from the sun as she pruned her roses. "Morning," I called out, forcing cheer into my voice. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "How's the house treating you?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "It's taking some getting used to. Lots of noises at night." She nodded knowingly. "It always starts small." I frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Caldwell leaned on her pruning shears and looked at me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "That house has a way of testing people, seeing how much they can handle. It starts with noises, cold spots, smells." The mention of smells made my stomach turn. "And then?" Her gaze sharpened. "And then it decides if you're worth keeping." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "You make it sound like the house is alive." She didn't respond, just went back to trimming her roses. That afternoon, I decided to distract myself by exploring the house. Maybe I could uncover the source of the smells or figure out why the footsteps seemed so loud at night. I started in the attic. The narrow staircase leading up to it was steep and creaky, and I had to duck my head to avoid hitting the low ceiling. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Old furniture covered in white sheets stood like forgotten ghosts. Cardboard boxes were stacked haphazardly in the corners, some of them bulging with their contents. The air was thick with dust, making me cough as I moved through the space. It wasn't long before I found something unusual, an old wooden chest tucked away in the far corner. It was large and heavy, with ornate carvings on the lid that looked almost like symbols or runes. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down, brushing away the thick layer of dust that coated the surface. The chest was locked, but the lock was rusted and weak. I found a metal rod nearby and managed to pry it open with a few hard tugs. Inside, I found a collection of strange items. A leather-bound journal, a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, and several small jars filled with what looked like black powder or ash. The journal caught my attention immediately. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, but as I flipped through the pages, a few phrases stood out. "The veil grows thinner," "Ritual complete," "A door has been opened." I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever had written this had been deeply involved in something I couldn't begin to understand. The final entry was dated over 70 years ago and read, "I fear I have gone too far. The door cannot be closed, and I am no longer alone in this house. They watch me even now from the shadows. If anyone finds this, leave this place. Do not stay. The house belongs to them now." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch and ripple as if they were alive. Grabbing the journal and the herbs, I hurried back downstairs, leaving the chest and its unsettling contents behind. That night, the house was anything but quiet. The footsteps started earlier than usual, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the upstairs hallway. I stayed in the living room, clutching the journal like it was some kind of shield. But it wasn't just the footsteps anymore. There were whispers now, soft and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. They came from every direction, surrounding me, growing louder until I could almost make out the words. I shouted, "Who's there?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, the house was deathly silent. Then came the knock. It wasn't at the front door or the windows. It came from inside the house. 3 slow, deliberate knocks against the wall behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, the smell of rot more intense, and I could feel it now, that oppressive presence watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the house turned on, the journal open in my lap, and the strange herbs clutched in my hands like a talisman. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. Something was in this house with me, and it didn't want me to leave. I woke up to the pale light of dawn filtering through the blinds, though I wasn't sure if I had truly fallen asleep at all. My head throbbed, my muscles ached, and my nerves felt frayed, like a thread pulled taut and ready to snap. The house was quiet now, as if nothing had happened the night before. The absence of sound only made me more uneasy. It was like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to convince myself to leave. I even made it as far as packing a small bag and grabbing my car keys. But as I stood at the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, a strange thought crept into my mind. Asterisk, you can't leave. It won't let you asterisk. The thought felt foreign, like it didn't belong to me. I shook my head, trying to banish it, but my hand dropped from the knob. Instead of leaving, I found myself wandering back to the living room, the journal still sitting where I had left it on the coffee table. Against my better judgment, I opened it again. The spidery handwriting seemed to almost crawl across the pages, and the further I read, the more unsettled I became. The writer had been meticulous, documenting every sound, every shadow, every unexplained event. One entry caught my eye. They are strongest at night, but they are always here. Watching. Waiting. I tried to banish them, but the door remains open. If you are reading this, know that the house will test you. It will learn your fears. And it will use them against you. I slammed the journal shut and pushed it away, but the words clung to my mind like cobwebs. What kind of door was the writer talking about? And who or what were they? The day passed in a blur of anxiety. I tried to distract myself with cleaning, organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By evening, the oppressive atmosphere of the house had only grown worse. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to deepen as the sun dipped below the horizon. I decided to go out for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The streets were quiet, the neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. I passed a few houses with warm, inviting lights in their windows and felt a pang of envy for the people inside. As I rounded the corner, I nearly bumped into a man walking his dog. He was tall and thin, with a weathered face and sharp, calculating eyes. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Evening," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're the one who moved into the old Harrow house, aren't you?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Brave of you. Most people don't last more than a week in that place." "What do you mean?" I asked, my curiosity overriding my fear. His expression darkened. "That house has a history. People hear things, see things, things they can't explain. And it always gets worse the longer you stay." I swallowed hard. "What happened to the previous tenants?" He hesitated, then said, "The last family left in the middle of the night. Barely took anything with them. Said the house was cursed." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you believe them?" He looked at me for a long moment before replying. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I've heard more stories about that house than I can count. If I were you, I'd leave before it's too late." With that, he tipped his hat again and continued on his way, his dog trotting along beside him. I stood there for a moment, his words echoing in my mind. When I finally made my way back to the house, the sight of it looming in the darkness sent a fresh wave of dread washing over me. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately, stronger now, a sickly sweet stench of decay. The house was darker than it should have been, the light bulbs casting feeble, flickering light. As I stepped inside, I heard it again, the footsteps. They were louder this time, heavier, as if whatever was making them wanted me to know it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate, before stopping directly above me. I stared at the ceiling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. Then a low guttural whisper, "Asterisk, get out." Asterisk. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I bolted for the stairs, determined to find the source of the sound. My fear was overridden by a desperate need for answers. As I reached the top of the staircase, the temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The hallway was pitch black, but I could feel it. Something was there, waiting for me. I reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. My phone's flashlight was the only source of illumination as I moved cautiously down the hall. The footsteps started again, this time behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the door to the master bedroom creaked open. I approached it slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Inside, the room was freezing, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift, and I could feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. On the floor in the center of the room was a single item, a child's toy, an old, battered teddy bear with one button eye missing. As I stepped closer, the door slammed shut behind me and the room plunged into darkness. The last thing I heard before the scream started was the sound of heavy breathing, right next to my ear. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My breath caught in my throat, and my body froze as the sound of that heavy, guttural breathing surrounded me, so close it felt like the source was mere inches away. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the room, illuminating nothing but shifting shadows. The breathing grew louder, raspier, as if whatever it was struggled to contain itself. A deep chill seeped into my bones, paralyzing me. My thoughts spun wildly, trying to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. Suddenly, the flashlight steadied, its beam locking onto the teddy bear. It hadn't moved, but somehow it felt alive. The single remaining button eye seemed to glint maliciously in the flickering light, and the shadows around it danced like they had minds of their own. Then the breathing stopped. The silence was worse. It was thick, oppressive, pressing down on me from all sides. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, filling the void. And then, as if from nowhere, came the faintest sound, the soft creak of the floorboards directly behind me. I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but the beam landed on nothing. Nothing but the empty room, the peeling wallpaper, and the cold, unmoving air. "Who's there?" My voice came out as a whisper, weak and trembling. No response. I edged backward toward the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the room. My hand groped blindly for the doorknob, but it wasn't there. The door. It was gone. Panic surged through me as I turned fully around to face where the door had been. Instead of the familiar wooden frame, there was only a blank, unbroken wall. My chest tightened. I banged my fists against the wall, hoping, praying that it was some kind of trick, that the door was still there. "Let me out!" I shouted, the sound echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The room responded. The air grew heavier, almost tangible, pressing against my skin. The temperature dropped further, and the smell of decay intensified until I gagged, my stomach churning. And then I heard it. A low, guttural chuckle, emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have stayed," the voice rasped, deep and malevolent, the words dragging like nails on a chalkboard. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the shadows seemed to coalesce into a figure. A tall, gaunt silhouette with impossibly long limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. And then it lunged. I don't remember screaming, but the raw, searing pain in my throat told me I must have. I stumbled backward, tripping over the teddy bear, and fell hard to the ground. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, its beam cutting erratically through the darkness. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The room was silent again, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The teddy bear was still there, lying on its side, but something about it had changed. Its missing button eye had been replaced, not with another button, but with a human eye, bloodshot and staring directly at me. I kicked the bear across the room, my stomach lurching in disgust, and grabbed the flashlight. It was dim now, its battery nearly drained, but it was enough to reveal that the door had returned. I didn't hesitate. I bolted for the door, wrenching it open and hurtling into the hallway. But the house wasn't the same. The walls seemed to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond, and the floor beneath me felt soft, almost spongy, as if it weren't solid anymore. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the end of it shrouded in darkness. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. The floor shifted beneath my feet, threatening to trip me, but I kept moving, my breath ragged and my heart pounding. The hallway twisted and turned, the architecture defying logic. Doors appeared and disappeared, their handles rattling as if something inside was trying to get out. And then I saw it, the front door. It was just ahead, glowing faintly in the darkness like a beacon. I sprinted toward it, but as I reached out to grab the handle, the door dissolved into shadow, leaving me standing in front of a blank wall. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "No, no, no." The house groaned, a deep, resonant sound that felt like it was laughing at me. The walls began to close in, the space around me shrinking. I dropped to my knees, my body racked with sobs. I couldn't fight it anymore. Whatever this house was, it had won. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The walls stilled, the floor solidified, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I was back in the hallway, everything seemingly normal again. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, and made my way back to the living room. The journal was still there, lying open on the coffee table. This time, I didn't hesitate. I picked it up and began flipping through the pages, desperate for answers. One passage caught my eye. "The door is open and it cannot be closed. The house feeds on fear, on despair. It will take everything from you piece by piece until there is nothing left. If you are still here, then it has chosen you." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I dropped the journal and backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out. I didn't care what it took. I couldn't stay in this house another night. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming closer. The footsteps were unmistakable. Each one fell with deliberate weight, echoing through the silence of the house like a death knell. My entire body tensed, and I spun toward the sound, clutching the dim flashlight in my trembling hand like it could somehow protect me. The hallway behind me was empty, or at least it seemed that way. Shadows danced across the walls, thrown by the weak and flickering beam of my flashlight, and the air was heavy with that same cloying, rotting smell. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but I still couldn't see anything. Who's there? I managed to choke out, though my voice sounded thin and hollow in the oppressive silence. The footsteps stopped, and then something else began. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragging across wood, came from the ceiling. My gaze shot upward, and I instinctively aimed the flashlight. The beam caught movement, something scuttling, fast and spider-like across the ceiling. No, I whispered, stumbling backward. The thing on the ceiling moved too quickly for me to get a good look at it, but I caught glimpses of long, skeletal limbs and pale, hairless skin. It darted across the beams with unnatural speed, circling me like a predator toying with its prey. And then it stopped directly above me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest as I felt the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting until I could see my breath. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted down the hallway, my flashlight bouncing erratically and casting wild shadows. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls bending and warping in impossible ways. Doors appeared and disappeared, leading to nowhere. The hallway stretched endlessly, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear it, heavy, thudding footsteps now, as if whatever had been on the ceiling had dropped to the floor and was chasing me. I rounded a corner and skidded to a stop, nearly tripping over my own feet. Ahead of me was a door I hadn't seen before. It was old, its wood warped and splintered, with deep claw marks gouged into its surface. I didn't have a choice. I yanked the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The room was dark, the air thick and suffocating. My flashlight flickered weakly, its battery nearly dead, but it was enough to reveal the space. It was a small, windowless room, the walls lined with strange, hand-drawn symbols. They were crude and unsettling, scrawled in what looked like dried blood. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a clear path that led to the center of the room, where a single object sat. A wooden box. It was small and unassuming, its surface intricately carved with more of those strange symbols. Despite everything in me screaming not to touch it, I found myself drawn to it, as if an invisible force was pulling me forward. I knelt down and hesitated, my hand hovering above the box. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the box itself was radiating some kind of energy. And then I heard it again. The breathing. It was coming from inside the box. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the sound continued, deep and rhythmic, growing louder with each passing second. Against my better judgment, I reached out and opened the box. Inside was a small leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its edges frayed and its cover cracked with age. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the leather cold and rough against my skin. The moment I opened the book, the room changed. The walls began to pulse, the symbols glowing faintly as a low, guttural hum filled the air. The temperature plummeted even further, and the faint smell of decay grew stronger, choking me. The pages of the book were covered in illegible writing, strange characters that seemed to shift and writhe on the paper as I stared at them. But one word stood out, written in bold, jagged letters across the center of the page. Dead. What does this mean? I whispered, my voice barely audible. As if in response, the book's pages began to turn on their own, flipping rapidly until they settled on another word, scrawled in the same jagged script. Return. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, as the symbols on the walls began to swirl, spinning faster and faster until they blurred together. The book slipped from my hands, falling to the floor with a dull thud. And then the door burst open. A cold wind rushed into the room, extinguishing my flashlight completely and plunging me into darkness. I could feel it, something massive, something inhuman, entering the room. Its presence was suffocating, filling every corner of the space. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, my entire body trembling. And then I saw them. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, all fixated on me. A deep, guttural voice rumbled through the air, shaking the very foundation of the house. "You opened the door," it said, each word reverberating through my skull. I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The eyes moved closer, and I could feel the cold emanating from whatever was watching me. "You belong to me now," the voice growled, its tone final and absolute. And then everything went black. I awoke to silence. My body ached as if I had been crushed under a great weight, and my head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling above me, trying to piece together what had happened. The room was no longer the strange, symbol-covered chamber. It was my bedroom. The faint morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting pale stripes across the hardwood floor. Had it all been a nightmare? I pushed myself up slowly, every muscle protesting the movement. My clothes were damp with sweat, and my throat felt raw as if I had been screaming for hours. The book. The memory hit me like a thunderclap. The leather-bound book, the glowing symbols, the voice. I scrambled out of bed, my heart racing. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I hurried to the hallway. Everything looked normal, no warped walls, no unnatural shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the house itself was watching me. I went back to the room where I'd found the box, but when I opened the door, it was just an empty storage closet. No strange symbols, no glowing walls. The box and the book were gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself that it had been a vivid hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare. But deep down, I knew better. The house had changed. It wasn't the obvious things, everything looked the same. It was the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, thicker, like I was moving through water. The faint smell of decay lingered, no matter how many windows I opened or how much air freshener I sprayed. And then there was the noise. It started that night, just after midnight. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the house. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too consistent. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the noise, gripping a kitchen knife I had grabbed on instinct. It led me to the living room, where the tapping seemed to be coming from the fireplace. The hearth was cold and dark, and used since I had moved in. I crouched down, peering inside, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows against the soot-covered bricks. The tapping stopped, and then something whispered my name. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I scrambled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "Jonathan." I froze. No one knew my name here, not even my neighbor, who had only referred to me as the new guy. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. They weren't angry or threatening, but desperate, pleading. "Help us. Don't leave us. Jonathan." I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, felt the oppressive weight of the house pressing down on me. By the third night, I was barely holding it together. I was jumpy, irritable, and convinced I was losing my mind. I decided to confront the neighbor, desperate for answers. Mrs. Holloway answered her door with a wary expression, her frail frame barely visible behind the chain lock. "I need to ask you about the house," I blurted out. "Please, it's important." Her eyes darted around nervously before she unlatched the chain and motioned for me to come in. The inside of her house was cluttered but cozy, a stark contrast to the oppressive emptiness of mine. She offered me tea, which I declined, and sat across from me at the small kitchen table. "What do you want to know?" she asked, her voice low. "Everything," I said. "The rumors, the history, whatever you know." She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her shawl. "People say that house is cursed," she began. "They say the man who built it, Daniel Whitaker, was a strange one. Kept to himself mostly, but there were stories." "What kind of stories?" I pressed. She glanced at the window as if afraid someone might overhear. "They say he was into dark things, occult rituals, seances, summoning spirits. People in the town started noticing strange things happening. Animals disappearing, strange lights in the woods behind the house. Then one night he just vanished." "Vanished?" "Gone without a trace. Some say he opened a door to something he couldn't close and, well, whatever he brought through took him." A chill ran down my spine. "What about the people who lived there after him?" Mrs. Holloway's face darkened. "No one stays in that house for long. The last tenant, he ran out in the middle of the night, screaming about shadows and voices. Before that, a family left without a word, abandoning all their belongings. It's always the same. People hear things, see things. They say the house has a way of getting under your skin. Her words lingered in my mind as I walked back to my house, the faint tapping already starting up again as I crossed the threshold. This time I didn't follow the sound. Instead, I sat in the living room staring at the fireplace, waiting. And sure enough, just past midnight, the whispering started again. "Jonathan, come back." By the time the voices began again, I was ready, or at least I thought I was. I sat in the living room, knife on the coffee table, flashlight in hand, the harsh beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The tapping from the fireplace had become a nightly ritual, as predictable as the rising moon. But tonight I wouldn't run. Tonight I would face whatever was waiting. The whispers started softly, like a breeze through dry leaves. "Jonathan?" I leaned forward, heart pounding in my chest as the voices swirled around me. "Help us, find us, bring us back." "Back from where?" I whispered, my voice trembling despite my resolve. The room seemed to contract, the air growing heavy, pressing down on me. The whispers overlapped, incoherent at first, but then one voice cut through the rest, low, guttural, and unmistakably angry. "You don't belong here." I shot to my feet, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The fireplace roared to life, flames bursting forth where there had been nothing but cold, dead ash. The fire wasn't natural. It burned blue and white, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was smoke, a dark, billowing shape rising from the flames. But as it grew, it took form, limbs twisting and stretching unnaturally, its face an ever-shifting mask of agony and rage. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the spot as the thing stepped out of the fireplace, the flames licking at its feet but leaving no mark. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, invasive presence probing at the edges of my mind. "You brought this upon yourself," it said, its voice a chorus of anguish and malice. I don't understand," I stammered, backing away as it advanced. The thing stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it lunged forward, passing through me like a cold wind. My vision blurred, the world spinning as images flooded my mind. Daniel Whitaker, the house as it once was, the rituals, the symbols etched into the walls, and the moment it all went wrong. Whitaker had been desperate. His obsession with the occult had consumed him, driving him to seek power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. He had opened a door that should have remained closed, and something had come through. I saw the moment of his undoing, the ritual spiraling out of control, the entity ripping through the fabric of reality. Whitaker had been the first, but he wasn't the last. The house had become a beacon, drawing others to it, feeding on their fear, their despair, their lives. The vision faded, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent again, the fire gone, the entity nowhere to be seen. But the oppressive weight remained, pressing down on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. I needed answers. The journal, I had to find it. Mrs. Holloway had mentioned Whitaker's obsession with documenting his experiments, his rituals. If there was a way to stop this, it had to be in his writings. But where would he have hidden something so important? I searched the house, tearing through every drawer, every closet, every dusty corner. Hours passed, the sun rising and casting pale light through the windows. Just as despair began to set in, I found it. The floorboard in the hallway was loose, barely held in place. Beneath it was a small lockbox. My hands shook as I pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing a weathered, leather-bound journal. The journal was thick, its pages filled with cramped, meticulous handwriting, sketches of symbols, and detailed accounts of rituals. As I flipped through it, the sense of dread grew stronger. Whitaker's notes were obsessive, descending into madness as he documented his experiments. He had believed he could control the entity, bend it to his will, but it had quickly become clear that he was the one being controlled. Near the end of the journal, I found a passage that chilled me to the core. Asterisk, the house is alive. It sees, it hears, it hungers. I have become its servant, its prisoner. I fear there is no escape. The door I open cannot be closed, and the thing that came through, it waits. Asterisk. Beneath the passage was a crude map of the house, with one area circled in red, an area I hadn't explored yet. The basement. I had avoided it since moving in, the dark, musty space too unwelcoming for even my growing curiosity. But now I had no choice. If there was any hope of understanding what was happening, of surviving, I had to go down there. Armed with the journal, a flashlight, and the kitchen knife, I made my way to the basement door. It creaked open reluctantly, revealing steep, rickety stairs that disappeared into darkness. The smell hit me immediately, damp, moldy, with an underlying stench of rot. Every step down felt like a descent into another world. The air grew colder, thicker, each breath a struggle. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that only made the shadows seem more alive. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a low, cramped space lined with stone walls. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp, and the air hummed with an unnatural energy. In the center of the room was a circle etched into the dirt, filled with symbols I recognized from the journal. Candles, long since melted down to waxy stubs, surrounded the circle, their holders rusted and tarnished. As I stepped closer, the air seemed to vibrate, a low, almost imperceptible hum filling my ears. The journal's final entry echoed in my mind. Asterisk, the thing that came through, it waits. Asterisk. And then, from the shadows, I heard it again. Jonathan? The basement was alive with whispers. They slithered out from the corners, brushing against my ears like an icy breeze. My flashlight flickered, its beam erratic as though it too was terrified of what lay ahead. The sound of my name repeated, weaving through the air with a sinister familiarity. Jonathan. Jonathan. Each time it spoke, the voice grew louder, closer, until it felt as if someone was whispering directly into my ear. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as my pulse thundered in my ears. The circle in the dirt seemed to pulse faintly, its etched symbols glowing with a dim, otherworldly light. I stepped closer, compelled by a force I didn't fully understand. The journal trembled in my hand as if warning me to stop, but I couldn't. My eyes locked on the center of the circle, where the dirt seemed to ripple like water. And then it appeared. A hand, gaunt, skeletal, and covered in blackened, shriveled flesh, emerged from the ground. Its fingers clawed at the air, curling and uncurling in unnatural jerks. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Another hand followed, pulling up the shape of a hunched figure. It dragged itself from the circle with agonizing slowness, its movements disjointed, like a puppet with broken strings. The thing was humanoid, but wrong. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its face, or what remained of it, was a patchwork of decayed skin and exposed bone. Empty eye sockets oozed darkness, and its mouth, impossibly wide, split open to reveal rows of jagged, uneven teeth. I scrambled backward, my back slamming into the cold stone wall. The thing's head snapped toward me, its eyeless gaze pinning me in place. "You," it hissed, its voice a mixture of human agony and something ancient, inhuman. The journal, still clutched in my trembling hands, began to vibrate violently. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a symbol I hadn't noticed before. It was different from the others, more intricate, more sinister. A single word was scrawled beneath it in Whitaker's frantic handwriting. Asterisk, seal. Asterisk. The creature advanced, each step heavy and deliberate. The dirt beneath its feet smoldered, tiny tendrils of smoke rising where it tread. I forced myself to look at the journal, my eyes scanning the surrounding text for answers. Whitaker had written about this. He called it the Keeper, a manifestation of the house's hunger, the entity that fed on those who dared to enter its domain. According to him, the circle wasn't just a gateway, it was a trap. The creature lunged, its elongated arms reaching for me. I barely managed to roll out of the way, the knife clattering to the ground as I hit the dirt. Its fingers raked across the wall where I had been, leaving deep, smoking gouges in the stone. I grabbed the flashlight, its beam weak and faltering, and swung it toward the circle. The glow of the symbols intensified, as if reacting to the creature's presence. "Seal it," I muttered, the word tumbling out of my mouth without thought. The creature screeched, a high-pitched wail that made my teeth ache. It recoiled from the circle, its movements frantic and disjointed. The journal's pages flipped again, revealing instructions for a sealing ritual. The steps were simple but horrifyingly specific. I had to finish what Whitaker couldn't. With the journal open on the ground, I scrambled to gather the items scattered around the basement. Wax from the melted candles, shards of broken glass, and a rusted dagger I found buried in the dirt. The creature circled me, its movements predatory, but it stayed just out of reach of the circle. "Jonathan," it growled, its voice dripping with malice. "You cannot escape this." Ignoring it, I placed the items in their respective positions around the circle, following the diagram in the journal. My hands shook so badly that I nearly dropped the dagger. As I worked, the creature grew more frantic, pacing the edge of the circle and clawing at the air. "You don't know what you're doing," it howled, its voice rising to an ear-splitting pitch. "You'll make it worse." I hesitated, the words sinking into my mind like barbs. What if it was right? What if sealing the circle unleashed something even worse? But I didn't have time to dwell. The creature lunged, its claws grazing my arm and leaving a searing pain in their wake. I cried out, falling to my knees inside the circle. With no other choice, I plunged the dagger into the center of the circle, exactly where the journal instructed. The effect was immediate. The symbols flared to life, their light blindingly bright. The creature screamed, its body convulsing as tendrils of light wrapped around it, pulling it toward the center of the circle. I shielded my eyes, the light and sound overwhelming as the creature was dragged back into the earth. And then, silence. The glow of the symbols faded, leaving only the dim beam of my flashlight. The air was heavy with the smell of burned earth and decay, and the oppressive energy that had filled the basement was gone. I collapsed onto the dirt, my entire body trembling. For a moment I thought it was over. But as I stood, something caught my eye. The symbols, faint but still visible, pulsed weakly in the dirt. A low hum resonated in the air, barely audible but unmistakable. The circle wasn't sealed. Not completely. The journal's final words came back to me, "The door I opened cannot be closed." The basement was dark, heavy with a silence that felt more alive than empty. Even with the creature gone, or perhaps trapped, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The weak, rhythmic pulsing of the symbols on the dirt floor sent a chill up my spine. I had followed the ritual to the letter, but something was wrong. The flashlight flickered in my trembling hand. I reached for the journal, now smeared with dirt and sweat, and thumbed through the pages, desperate for answers. My eyes scanned Whitaker's frantic notes, looking for anything I might have missed. "The seal is temporary," one line read. "The house will not let go. It feeds." I slammed the journal shut, frustration boiling over. My head was pounding, and the faint hum emanating from the circle felt like it was burrowing into my skull. The thought of staying in the house for even another minute made my stomach turn, but where would I go? I was alone in this town, with no family to call and no friends to lean on. I turned off the flashlight to conserve its battery and climbed the stairs, my every step punctuated by the groaning wood beneath me. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I reached the top of the stairs and closed the basement door, leaning against it as though my weight could keep whatever was down there from coming back up. But I knew the house had no boundaries. It wasn't just the basement. It was everywhere. I stumbled into the kitchen and splashed cold water on my face, trying to clear my head. The sink groaned as the water sputtered out, its pressure weaker than usual. The mirror above the sink caught my attention, its fogged surface distorting my reflection. I wiped it clean with a shaking hand, only to wish I hadn't. There was something behind me. Not a person, not fully formed. A shadow, vague and undefined, hovering in the corner of the room. My breath hitched and I spun around, but nothing was there. The kitchen was empty, its dim light casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. I turned back to the mirror, but the shadow was gone. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, as if I'd aged a decade in a matter of hours. I retreated to the living room, sinking into the old armchair near the window. The curtains were still drawn, and I resisted the urge to peek outside, afraid of what I might see. The journal sat on the coffee table, daring me to open it again, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. The night stretched on, the house creaking and settling around me. I tried to convince myself that the worst was over, that the ritual had worked. But then the footsteps started. Soft at first, like someone pacing in the room above me. The attic. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up as the sound grew louder, heavier. The pacing turned into deliberate, slow steps, moving directly above me. They stopped suddenly, as if whoever, or whatever, it was had realized I was listening. "Jonathan?" The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It wasn't the guttural growl of the creature from the basement. This voice was smoother, more human. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to go upstairs. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to ignore the voice, to run out of the house and never look back. But I couldn't leave it unanswered. I grabbed the flashlight and started up the stairs, my legs shaking with each step. The old wood groaned beneath my weight, and the air grew colder the higher I climbed. By the time I reached the attic door, I could see my breath misting in front of me. The door was ajar, just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. I pushed it open with trembling fingers, the hinges screeching like a wounded animal. The attic was empty, or so it seemed at first. My flashlight beam swept across the cluttered space, illuminating dusty furniture and forgotten boxes. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind an old wardrobe, stood a figure. It was motionless, its back turned to me, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached, the figure began to shift, not turning around but swaying slightly as if caught in an invisible breeze. "Jonathan," the voice came again, this time from all around me, echoing off the walls. The figure's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and I froze, unable to take another step. The flashlight beam flickered and died, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled with it, slapping it against my palm, but it wouldn't turn back on. And then I felt it. Cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The attic was empty. When I turned back toward the corner, the figure was gone. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard and landing hard on the ground. The air was thick with the sound of whispers now, overlapping and chaotic, each voice calling my name in a different tone. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the attic, slamming the door shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me down the stairs, growing louder, more insistent. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wasn't done with me yet. The whispers hadn't stopped. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to drown out the voices that seemed to be everywhere. They slithered through the cracks in the walls, curled beneath the floorboards, and seeped into my mind like a slow poison. There were too many of them, each one calling my name, pulling me in different directions, begging me to listen. But I couldn't. I stumbled down the hallway, heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air had turned thick again, and the temperature had dropped to an unbearable chill. I had no idea what time it was anymore. Hours had slipped by in a blur, my senses warped by the constant pressure of the house pressing in around me. I needed to get out. But where would I go? I found myself in the kitchen again, leaning over the counter, hands trembling. The sound of the whispers was muffled here, as if the thick walls of the room were blocking them out. But I could still hear them faintly. They were relentless. A sudden creak of the floorboards broke through my thoughts. I turned, but no one was there. I stepped closer to the door, my pulse pounding in my throat. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't keep running from it. I grabbed the journal from the coffee table, flipping through its pages with urgency. There had to be something more, something I'd missed. Asterisk, asterisk, it doesn't end, asterisk, asterisk, one line read. Asterisk, asterisk, the house never forgets. The curse is eternal. Only those who leave are free. But only for a time, asterisk, asterisk. I clenched my fists, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. But the longer I stayed in this house, the more I realized how right Whitaker had been. The house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was a gateway, a portal to something worse. The door to the basement creaked open on its own. I froze. The house was calling me back. I couldn't stay in the kitchen any longer. My body was moving before my mind could process the decision. My legs took me to the basement door, and my hand grasped the handle, pulling it open. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The stairs descended into total darkness, the beam from my flashlight weak against the endless black. But I couldn't turn back now. With one last deep breath, I descended. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air stinging my skin like needles. I felt my way around the walls, trying to focus through the haze of fear clouding my mind. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, echoing through the stillness of the space. I stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do next. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, quivering shadows that seemed to move on their own. The floor beneath me groaned. And then I heard it. The sound of something dragging across the floor. A soft, slow scrape. My heart skipped a beat. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. The dragging continued, closer now, as if something, or someone, was moving toward me. I backed up, nearly stumbling over my own feet. My head was spinning, my thoughts scrambled. I couldn't let myself give in to the fear. I had to stay calm. The dragging grew louder, more distinct. The sound wasn't coming from the floor anymore, it was coming from the walls. I ran to the far corner of the basement, stumbling into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. In the farthest corner, behind an old shelf, was a dark shape. It was large, sprawling across the floor like a pool of ink. But it wasn't liquid. It was moving, crawling. I felt my stomach twist as I took a step closer. The flashlight flickered again, its beam dancing across the shape, revealing it to be something worse. A mass of twisted limbs and eyes, its body made of shadows that shifted and writhed like liquid darkness. Its eyes, though, they were wide and bulging, filled with an unnatural hunger. It had been waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the house hadn't just trapped me inside. It had drawn me down here for a reason. The ritual had failed. The door had been opened, and whatever this thing was, it had been unleashed. It was feeding on the house, growing stronger. And now it wanted me. I ran. My feet flew across the basement floor, but the walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing thinner and colder with each passing second. I felt the creature's presence behind me, its eyes burning into the back of my neck. The weight of its gaze was unbearable, suffocating. I reached the stairs, but they seemed to stretch further away. I reached out, my hand brushing the railing as I stumbled upwards, but my legs were like lead. The thing was close now, too close. I could hear it breathing. I burst into the living room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, my breath ragged. I slid down against the wall, my mind reeling. The house was alive, yes, but this creature, whatever it was, had become part of it. And I had no idea how to stop it. The whispers began again, louder than before, filling the house with their maddening calls. It wasn't just me anymore. It was calling to something. Or someone. I could feel it. I had to leave. But I couldn't. The house wouldn't let me. I sat in the corner of the living room, trembling, trying to regain my composure. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. The whispers had stopped, but I could still hear them echoing in my mind, taunting me, urging me to go back. Back to the basement, back to the thing that had followed me from the shadows. I wiped my face, trying to clear the fog in my mind. But I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun it forever. The house had me. It always had. The thought chilled me to the bone. I glanced around the room, looking for something, anything, that could offer me a clue, a way out, or at least some kind of explanation. My eyes landed on the old fireplace. It had been so quiet, so forgotten in the chaos of my fear. But now it felt different, like it was calling to me. The air in front of it was still heavy. I stood up shakily, my legs unsteady beneath me. The house groaned again, the floorboards creaking in warning. It was as if the house itself knew I was about to make a decision, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crossed the room slowly, every step feeling like it was being watched. The old fireplace loomed ahead, its darkened mantle covered in dust and soot. I hesitated for a moment, but the pull was too strong. There was something hidden here, something important, and I had to know what it was. I knelt down and brushed my fingers over the mantle, feeling the cold stone beneath my touch. The wood of the floor creaked again, louder this time. The house was alive, and it was listening. I ran my hand along the edge of the mantle until I felt a small indentation. A hidden switch, or so it seemed. My breath hitched as I pressed it. The sound of stone grinding against stone filled the room, and before I knew it, the fireplace slid open, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The hidden passage was barely wide enough to fit my shoulders. I could hear the air down there, damp and musty, swirling in the depths. There was another doorway. Another part of the house I hadn't discovered. I stared into the darkness, but I didn't need to see it to know what was waiting for me on the other side. The whispers came back louder now. They weren't just voices anymore. They were commands, urgent and insistent. Asterisk, asterisk, come closer, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk, asterisk, it's here, asterisk, asterisk. I could feel the weight of their pull, the pressure on my chest, as though something unseen was dragging me forward, urging me into the unknown. But I didn't have a choice. I had to know. I took a deep breath and stepped into the passageway. The air inside was thick and heavy, clinging to my skin like cobwebs. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the narrow walls. The stone walls were damp, cold to the touch. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow space, making everything feel suffocatingly close. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing with each step. I felt claustrophobic, my mind racing with questions. What was down here? What had the house been hiding? And why was it leading me to it? Suddenly, I heard it again, the scraping sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart in my throat. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Something, or someone, was moving in the dark. The floor beneath my feet shifted, and I stumbled, catching myself on the cold stone wall. My breath was coming in short gasps now, panic threatening to consume me. I had to keep going. I had no choice. The passage opened into a small chamber, its walls covered in dark symbols, the kind I recognized from the journal. But they were different now, twisted, warped, as if they had been drawn in haste, desperation. In the center of the room stood an altar, covered in dust. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the same smell I'd noticed before. There were no windows, no light, only the faintest glow from my flashlight that barely touched the shadows. And then I saw it. On the altar lay an old, tattered book. It was bound in something that looked like leather, though I couldn't tell what it was. The pages were yellowed and brittle, as though they'd been untouched for years. I stepped closer, drawn to it. The whispers grew louder again, circling around me like a swarm of bees. I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, waiting for me to touch the book. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cover. The moment I made contact, a chill shot through my body, and the house seemed to shift. It was like the walls themselves were closing in. The whispers became deafening, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. Something was moving, something I couldn't see but could feel. Its presence, its breath, its hunger. I opened the book. The pages flipped open as if the book itself had been waiting for me. The words were written in a language I couldn't understand, but as my eyes scanned the pages, something inside me clicked. This was it. The ritual. The curse. The reason the house was alive, why it called to me, why it trapped everyone who had come before. I backed away from the altar, my heart racing, but before I could turn to leave, I felt it. Cold fingers brushed against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, except for the shadows. The shadows were moving. I bolted from the chamber, the book still clutched in my hand, but the passage was different now. It felt tighter, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me with every step. I didn't dare look behind me. I knew what was there. I had opened the door, and something was coming through. I didn't stop running. My feet pounded against the cold stone floor, each step more frantic than the last, my breath ragged and shallow. The whispers, no, the voices, had followed me. They echoed off the walls, louder now, sharper, like fingers scraping against glass. Asterisk, asterisk, it's too late, asterisk, asterisk. The voice was clear, cold, and unmistakable. Asterisk, asterisk, you opened the door, asterisk, asterisk. I stumbled forward, my mind racing, heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight in my hand flickered, threatening to die out, but I couldn't stop. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever was hunting me caught up. I reached the narrow end of the passage, but the door that should have led to the main room was gone. It was just solid stone now, as though the house had swallowed it whole. The air around me thickened, suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. The walls seemed to shift in the dim light, closing in from all sides. I spun around, my mind frantic, my eyes wild, but there was nothing. The house was silent, but I knew better. I could feel it. I looked down at the book I still clutched in my hands. The old leather-bound pages felt warm against my skin, almost as if it were alive, its presence smothering me. The whispers grew louder. Asterisk, asterisk, it will never leave, asterisk, asterisk. A cold gust of air swept through the passage, carrying with it the stench of decay. I didn't have time to think. I tore the book open again, my hands trembling as I flipped through its pages, my heart in my throat. Each page seemed to speak to me, words I didn't understand yet somehow felt deep inside me, like an ancient truth clawing its way out. I was out of options. I had to finish it. I began to chant the words aloud, the language foreign but strangely familiar. The more I spoke, the more the air around me seemed to warp, the very walls seeming to pulse, as if the house itself were alive, listening to the ritual. I felt a shift in the atmosphere, something heavy pressing down on me. The stone around me groaned like it was waking up. I finished the last word of the incantation, and for a moment, just a moment, everything was still. The house was quiet. The whispers ceased. The cold air settled into something resembling calm. But it didn't last. A figure appeared at the far end of the passage. Tall, shrouded in shadows, its shape not fully human but undeniably there. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in darkness, its outline barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. It was waiting, watching. I couldn't breathe. The temperature dropped. My chest tightened, every muscle frozen in terror. The thing, whatever it was, took a slow step toward me. Then another. The shadows around me seemed to stretch, twisting, warping, pulling me toward it. I could feel it, its grip on me, suffocating, cold like death itself. The house, the curse, it had been building, waiting for me to make that last mistake. And now it was here, ready to claim me. I turned and ran, but the passage seemed endless, the walls pressing closer, tighter. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the flashlight. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the house itself were moving, changing, becoming something else entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me, suffocating me. I could barely hear myself think over their chaotic chorus. Asterisk, asterisk, it's yours now, asterisk, asterisk. I stumbled, my feet catching on the uneven floor, and I collapsed to the ground, the book flying from my hands. When I looked up, the figure was closer. Too close. The cold reached me first, a biting, unnatural chill that felt like ice crawling under my skin. Then came the weight, pressing down on my chest, suffocating, unyielding. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Asterisk, asterisk, leave, asterisk, asterisk, the voice whispered in my ear. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. The shadows around me tightened, engulfing me in their cold, dark embrace. My vision blurred, the edges of reality bending, twisting, warping into something that wasn't real. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything stopped. The darkness lifted. The air returned to normal. The whispers faded. The house was silent once more. I blinked, confused, my head spinning. My heart was still pounding, my body shaking uncontrollably. Was it over? Had it been a dream? But when I looked around, the walls were the same. The stone, the shadows, the darkness. It hadn't changed. It hadn't let me go. I grabbed the book and scrambled to my feet, desperate, my body trembling. The air was still heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The curse wasn't gone. It was still here. I turned and fled down the passage, not caring where I was going. I had to get out. I had to escape. The house wasn't done with me. It wasn't finished yet. I ran out of the house, through the back door, and into the cold night air, my heart still racing. But even as I stepped outside, the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, wrapping around my thoughts, scratching at the edges of my mind. It wasn't over. Whatever haunted that house, whatever had been awakened, was still there. And now, it was waiting for the next person to step inside. I never went back, but I still hear the whispers sometimes. In the dark. When I'm alone. Waiting. It's still waiting for me. Story 2. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I'd imagined a fresh start, not this creeping feeling of unease that had settled in my chest ever since I'd moved into this old house. I'd just gotten divorced, my life turned upside down in a way I never expected. So, I thought moving into a new town, into a place that was mine and mine alone, would somehow help me reclaim control. I couldn't afford much, but I found a small, somewhat run-down house at the edge of town. It was charming in its own way, though I'd be lying if I didn't feel like something was off as soon as I stepped through the door. The house was old, really old, and it showed. The floors creaked under my feet with every step. The walls had that musty, forgotten smell, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. But the price was right, and I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd never been one to get caught up in details like that. I just wanted to settle in, get my bearings, and start fresh. The first few days went by without anything strange happening. I unpacked, cleaned up the place, and made it my own, finding comfort in the routine. I'd wake up in the morning, take a shower, and go to work at my new job. Nothing about the house felt threatening during the day, just the usual noises you'd expect from a place that had been around for decades. But at night, that's when things changed. I'd lay in bed trying to get some sleep, but I'd hear the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps that seemed to echo from somewhere upstairs. I'd tell myself it was the house settling. It had to be, right? Nothing more. But still, the sound lingered in the back of my mind as I drifted off to sleep. On the third night, I decided to take a walk outside to clear my head. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I stepped out, the cool air brushing my face. As I walked down the street, I noticed a neighbor standing on their porch. She was a woman, maybe in her late 40s, wearing a long cardigan. I'd seen her a few times, but we hadn't really spoken. New to the neighborhood? She asked with a curious smile. I nodded. Yeah, just moved in. Well, she said, glancing down at the ground for a moment, you're in that old house, aren't you? Yeah, I replied, unsure of where she was going with this. She took a deep breath, her smile fading slightly. It's got a history, you know. Some strange things have happened there. You might want to be careful. I raised an eyebrow. Strange things? She glanced at the house as if she were checking to make sure no one was listening. Well, nothing I can confirm for sure, but I've heard stories. The last tenant? He ran out of there in the middle of the night, terrified. Babbling about curses, hearing footsteps when no one was there. My curiosity piqued, but I didn't want to sound too eager. What kind of curses? She shook her head. I don't know. But whatever's in that house isn't good. Just keep that in mind. It's been empty for a while for a reason. I tried to laugh it off. I'm sure it's just an old house making noises. Nothing to worry about. She didn't seem convinced. Maybe. But people around here know the house has a reputation. She stepped back toward her door. Take care of yourself. I waved, still unsure what to make of her warning. Was she just being superstitious? Or was there something more to her story? The next few days passed and the house started to feel heavier. The noises grew louder, those footsteps, a scraping sound as if something was dragging across the floorboards. The odd smells were there too, faint but distinct, like a mix of damp earth and something rotting. But still, I told myself it was nothing. It had to be the age of the house, the settling. But then came the cold spots. It happened one night when I was in the living room, reading. A chill crept over me, sudden and sharp, like a cold wind sweeping across my skin. I glanced around, but the windows were shut. There was no breeze. The cold didn't make sense, and I shivered as it passed through me, leaving goosebumps in its wake. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I forced myself to ignore it. I had enough to deal with, adjusting to my new life without worrying about haunted houses. Still, that nagging sense of something watching me lingered. It wasn't until I had another encounter with the neighbor that I started to wonder if there was more to her story. I saw her again a few days later as I was walking to my car. She was standing by her porch, but this time she was looking directly at me, her expression serious. "You've been hearing it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low. I paused. "What do you mean?" "The footsteps, the cold spots, the strange noises. They're not just in your head. The house, it's got a past." I felt a tightness in my chest, a mix of curiosity and dread. "What happened to the last tenant?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice even more. "He was obsessed with the occult. Used to do rituals in that house. Some say he opened something, some kind of door to something else." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "What kind of rituals?" She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the street before meeting mine again. "I don't know the details, but the house was never the same after he left. It's like it's marked. Some of the people who've lived there say they felt watched, heard things that don't belong." I swallowed, my throat dry. The sounds, the cold spots, it was all starting to make sense. But I wasn't ready to believe it, not yet. I forced a smile. "I'm sure it's just an old house. Nothing more." But as I turned to walk away, the voice in my head whispered, "What if it's more than that?" As I stepped into the house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me back. The nights after our conversation lingered in my mind like a cloud. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just out of sight behind the thin walls of the house. I kept hearing the same odd sounds, footsteps, faint scratching noises, like something was dragging itself across the floors, moving in the shadows. At first, I tried to dismiss them as the house settling or maybe rats, anything that didn't involve something supernatural. But when the sounds came at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, they felt too deliberate to be dismissed as simple noises of age. The footsteps were heavier, like someone, or something, was walking around in the rooms above mine. The dragging sound wasn't random. It would start at the same spot on the floor as if it had a purpose and slowly move toward the staircase. It was as though whatever was making the noise was moving toward me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. The house was old, yes, and the floorboards creaked. The cold spots were probably just poor insulation. But with each passing day, the unease settled deeper into my bones. I decided to take a day off work to unpack the last of my things and do a bit of cleaning. It felt good to focus on something mundane like sorting through boxes and arranging the furniture. But even as I went through the motions, I couldn't help but notice the house seemed too quiet. The sounds I had grown accustomed to, the creaks of the floorboards, the soft groans of the walls, were all gone. I could hear my own breathing echo in the empty rooms. By evening I was on edge. I sat down on the couch with a book, trying to push the lingering unease away when I heard it again. A soft thud from upstairs, followed by a dragging sound. It was so distinct that I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house again, settling, shifting, but something about the sound made it feel like I wasn't alone. Like someone or something was up there. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I slowly ascended, the air getting colder the higher I went. The upstairs was dark, the only light coming from the thin slivers of daylight that sneaked through the curtains. I stood in the hallway listening. The dragging sound had stopped, but now I could hear soft whispers, like a muffled conversation from behind one of the closed doors. My heart thudded in my chest, my palms suddenly sweating. I couldn't just stand there. I had to know what was going on. I approached the nearest door, one that led into what seemed like a small bedroom. My hand hovered over the knob, hesitant, but I pushed it open anyway. The room was empty. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I stepped inside, the whispers returned, louder now, closer. I whirled around, my pulse spiking, but no one was there. The air around me had grown colder, and the floor beneath my feet creaked in a way that wasn't natural. A faint smell lingered in the air, something unpleasant, damp, musty, and earthy. It was almost as if something had been buried in the walls. I stepped back, the hairs on my neck standing on end. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but I knew it. The room wasn't empty. It was full of something. The sound of a door creaking shut behind me made me freeze. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. Slowly, I turned to see the door that I had just entered through was now closed. I rushed out of the room, my heart pounding, and descended the stairs in a panic. I didn't even stop to look around. I just needed to get out. I grabbed my coat, pulled it on, and stepped out into the cool night air, feeling the chill of it sink into my bones. I needed a break, something to distract me from the claustrophobic dread building inside the house. As I walked down the street, I found myself heading toward the neighbor's house. I needed to talk to her again, maybe get some answers. My mind was racing with questions, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that whatever was happening in that house was more than just old pipes and creaky floorboards. I knocked on her door, feeling a wave of uncertainty wash over me as the seconds passed. After a moment, the door creaked open. The same neighbor stood there, her face creased with concern when she saw my expression. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, but I didn't feel okay. "I need to know more about this house. The history of it." She studied me for a moment before stepping aside to let me in. "I knew you'd come around," she said quietly. We sat down at her small kitchen table. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something comforting, but I could barely focus on it. I was fixated on the words that had left her mouth. The history, the curses, the strange things that had happened in my house. She took a deep breath, and after a long silence, she began. The house was built in the early 1900s by a man named Gregory Hale. He was wealthy, but he wasn't just interested in money. He was obsessed with the occult, with things beyond our world. Some say he practiced rituals, things that weren't safe. There were whispers about him opening doors, making deals with forces we don't understand. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What kind of rituals?" She shook her head. "I don't know the details, but people say there were symbols drawn on the walls, strange, terrifying symbols. Some even said he was trying to summon something, but no one knew for sure what it was." I swallowed hard. "And after he left?" She hesitated, her eyes darkening. "People started experiencing things, strange noises, cold spots, voices. There were rumors that the house changed after he was gone, that something had been released, something that wouldn't leave." I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. This couldn't be real, could it? But everything that had been happening, asterisk, the footsteps, the cold spots, the whispers, asterisk, all of it seemed to match what she was saying. "You said people ran out of the house?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes, terrified. No one stays in that house for long. The last tenant, he was obsessed with the idea of getting to the bottom of what happened there. He found something. A journal, maybe. But he left in the middle of the night, and no one ever saw him again." I felt a knot in my stomach. The journal. I had to find it. Before I could speak, she stood up. "I'm sorry, but I think you need to leave. You don't want to dig too deep. Trust me." I left her house that night with more questions than answers, but something inside me couldn't stop. I had to know more. Whatever was in that house was real, and it had a past that was far darker than I could ever have imagined. As I walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting for me inside was getting closer. I didn't sleep that night. Not a single minute. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers from the house echoed in my mind. The air around me felt too thick, too heavy, and the cold from upstairs had seeped into my bones. I had to find that journal, the one the last tenant had found. I had to know what it contained, what truth lay hidden in its pages. The next morning, I forced myself out of bed and began my search. I started with the attic. The house had one, tucked away behind a creaky door in the farthest corner of the upstairs hallway. The door itself was covered in dust, the wood dark with age. I hesitated before I opened it. A deep, unsettling silence greeted me as I stepped into the attic. The air was thick and stale, smelling of old wood and something musty like forgotten memories. There were boxes everywhere, old furniture, forgotten keepsakes, and piles of newspapers, all left behind, abandoned. I sifted through the boxes, pushing aside old books and yellowing newspapers. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the sound eerily familiar, like someone was walking just behind me. But each time I spun around, I found nothing but dust and shadows. I spent hours in the attic, turning over everything I could find, but there was no sign of a journal. I was just about to give up when something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound book, tucked beneath a stack of old photographs. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was worn, the leather cracked, the pages yellowed with age. My heart raced as I opened it. The first page was filled with scribbled notes, strange symbols, and fragments of words that didn't make sense. But as I flipped through the pages, the handwriting became more legible. The words on the pages sent a chill down my spine. The door is open. The things inside are hungry. They wait for the one who is willing to listen, the one who dares to summon them. Do not seek the door. It will find you first. My breath caught in my throat as I continued reading. The ritual must be completed. The key must be placed in the fire, the blood spilled, and the door will open. It will call to you and you will answer. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. The words were madness. It sounded like some kind of dark ritual, a ritual that had opened a door to something unspeakable. The curse. The thing that had been released into the house. I sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breath, trying to wrap my mind around what I had just read. But the more I thought about it, the more everything seemed to fall into place. The strange occurrences, the whispers, the cold spots, it was all connected to whatever had been unleashed in that house. I knew I had to find out more, but I also knew I was treading into dangerous territory. The journal warned against seeking the door, but something inside me urged me to keep going. I needed to know what was truly in that house. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I put the journal down and glanced around the attic. Felt different, like something was watching me. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. I stood up quickly, brushing the dust off my clothes, and made my way back downstairs. That night, the house felt different. The air was colder, the shadows longer. As I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was too quiet, too still. Then the footsteps began again. Soft at first, like the slow shuffle of slippers on the hardwood floors. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But as the minutes passed, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. They were unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking across the floor above me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the room I had entered the night before, the one where the whispers had been. The dragging sound returned too, slow and deliberate, moving toward the staircase. I could feel my hands trembling as I stood up, my legs refusing to move. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something moving in the darkness. The house groaned in a way I'd never heard before, like it was alive, like it was waiting. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and let whatever was in the house continue to torment me. I needed answers. I needed to confront whatever was causing the noise. With trembling hands, I grabbed the journal and made my way back upstairs, each step echoing in the dead silence. The air was colder now, the whispers louder, as if the house was breathing around me. I stopped outside the bedroom door, the one that had felt so unsettling the night before. My hand hovered over the doorknob. My heart was in my throat, but I couldn't back out now. I pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I stepped inside, my breath hitching in my throat. The dragging sound started again, closer this time, right at the foot of the bed. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, but I saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a sudden, intense cold settle in the pit of my stomach. The room felt alive. It felt like something was watching me, something that wanted me to know it was there. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something moving under the bed. I knelt down slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The floor beneath me creaked as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the bed frame. A voice whispered, so low I almost didn't hear it. "You're not alone." I jerked my hand back, my heart leaping into my throat. The air grew colder still, the room darker. A soft click sounded from behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The door was now closed. I didn't remember closing it. I didn't even remember it being open. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, echoing in my ears. I reached for the doorknob, but my hand froze as I felt someone, pressing against me. The bed beneath me creaked again, and I felt a sudden weight as though someone was sitting next to me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then everything went silent. I didn't stay in that room a second longer. I bolted down the stairs and out the front door, my mind spinning. The house had gotten too close. It had seen me. and it was only a matter of time before it came for me. The fear settled in deep, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was in that house hadn't finished with me yet. Whatever had been unleashed in the dark, it wasn't done, and it would be waiting for the next person foolish enough to step through the door. As I stood on the porch, gasping for air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching me, waiting as it always had. I didn't go back to the house for days. My thoughts were consumed by it. The footsteps, the whispers, that damn door, whatever was in there, I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I couldn't shake the image of that bed creaking under the weight of something I couldn't see, the way the door had shut behind me as if the house itself had made the decision to keep me inside. I'd barely slept, consumed by visions of what might still be lurking there, waiting. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew I couldn't walk away. There was something inside that house, something far older than me, something I had to understand. I had to find out what the hell had been happening there, and what was still waiting for me. I sat in my car, parked a few feet from the house, staring at it through the windshield. The windows were dark, the house looming like a silent witness to some ancient crime. It was mocking me, daring me to come back, to open that door again. The heavy weight in my chest only grew, but I couldn't leave it like this. Not without answers. I stepped out of the car, my shoes crunching on the gravel as I approached the front door. My hand shook slightly as I gripped the cold brass handle. The door opened with a groan, the sound sending a ripple of unease through me. The house seemed to inhale with me as I crossed the threshold, the air inside colder than I remembered. The heavy silence felt even thicker now, more oppressive, like a fog that sank into my skin. As I entered the living room, I noticed something different. The temperature in the room was even lower than it had been before. My breath was visible in the air, swirling with the faint smell of mildew. The shadows stretched longer, more pronounced, as if the darkness itself was waiting, breathing with me. The house had changed. I moved cautiously through the space, my footsteps muffled on the old carpet. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet, rhythmic hum like a heartbeat. It wasn't real, I told myself. This was just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to make sense of the fear. But I wasn't convinced. The air was thick in the hallway, as though something was pressing in from all sides. I walked past the staircase, its banister splintered and warped, and headed for the room I'd fled from, the room with the bed that seemed to come alive with something unseen. My fingers grazed the doorframe and I hesitated. The house wasn't the same. There was something waiting. I felt it deep in my gut, a cold, nauseating pull. I took a slow breath and pushed the door open. It wasn't the same as before. The room was colder, so cold that the walls seemed to sweat, droplets of moisture clinging to the surface like tiny tears. The bed sat in the corner, untouched, but the air around it felt wrong. It was a thick, suffocating presence that I couldn't shake. I stepped inside, my footfalls barely making a sound. The floorboards creaked softly beneath me, but it wasn't the same creaking I had heard before. This was different, as if they were groaning in warning, pleading for me to leave. The whispers started again. This time they were louder, clearer. The voice was familiar, but twisted, as if it was trying to speak through layers of static. It called my name, the syllables stretched and broken, like something was trying to reach through from another world. Come closer. I froze. The words felt like they were inside my head. I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was losing my mind. But something in the room seemed to move, just at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Only shadows and the heavy, cold air. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run out of this house and never look back. But I had come this far. I needed to understand. I needed to know. I crossed the room to the far corner where the bed was, the floor creaking under my feet. There on the nightstand was something that hadn't been there before, a small black key. It sat there, glistening in the dim light, as if it had been waiting for me. I picked it up, feeling the cold metal in my palm. It was heavy, solid, as though it carried a weight far beyond its size. I could feel the pressure of it, the way it seemed to pulse with a dark energy. There was no mistaking it now. The house was alive. I looked around, my eyes scanning the room. There was no sign of any exit other than the door I'd come through. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was waiting for me to make the wrong move. It was as though the key had called me here, leading me to something I couldn't fully understand yet. A sudden chill ran down my spine. The whispers were louder now, almost unbearable, like voices from the past, voices that had died in this house, waiting to be heard again. They whispered of a door that led somewhere beyond. I turned, and that's when I saw it. A door I had never noticed before, standing just a few feet away from me, nestled in the farthest corner of the room. It was old, weathered, almost hidden by shadows. But now that I saw it, I couldn't look away. It felt like a pull, a magnetic force drawing me toward it. I walked toward it slowly, the key still heavy in my hand. Each step felt as though it took longer than the last, as if the room itself was stretching out, keeping me from reaching the door. I stopped just before it. The handle was cool, smooth against my palm. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the other side, like something was stirring in the dark. Something alive. I glanced back at the bed. The air around me seemed to grow colder still, as if whatever was behind that door was preparing itself, waiting for me to make my decision. I knew what I had to do. I slid the key into the lock, feeling it click as it turned. The door creaked open slowly, the sound sharp in the thick silence. I held my breath as I stepped inside. The room beyond was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything. I could feel the space around me, but I couldn't see a thing. A cold breeze brushed against my face, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. And then the whisper stopped. A weight settled in the air, a feeling that I couldn't explain. Something was there, in that darkness, in the room just beyond the door. Waiting. Watching. I had come too far now. There was no turning back. And then, without warning, I felt a hand. A cold, clammy hand brushed against my shoulder, a touch so light, yet so real that it sent shockwaves through me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness, thick and suffocating. But I could feel it. It was there. Something was in the house with me, and it wasn't going to let me leave. I couldn't breathe. Every inch of my skin felt like it was crawling, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand had been real, that cold touch that sent a shock through my whole body. I spun in place, frantic, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the blackness. Just the oppressive silence that weighed down on me like 1,000 unseen eyes. I backed away slowly, my fingers brushing against the cold walls. The air had thickened, turned almost suffocating. My senses were heightened, my nerves on fire. I could hear the faintest scraping sound, like something dragging against the floor. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send my mind into overdrive. Was it in the room with me? Was I being hunted? I couldn't see it, but I felt it, something moving in the dark, lurking just out of reach. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands trembling as I fumbled for my phone. I didn't know why. I wasn't sure it would help, but I needed something, some shred of light to cut through the suffocating blackness. The phone screen lit up, casting a weak glow around me. The dim light barely illuminated the edges of the room, revealing more shadows, more things I couldn't identify. I could hear the same dragging sound again, closer this time, like something was moving through the dark, pulling itself along. I tried to steady myself, tried to make sense of the irrational fear that gripped me, but it was no use. The air around me felt wrong. Heavy. I was standing in a place that had ceased to be ordinary long ago. I stepped back, my feet barely making a sound as they brushed against the floorboards. Then suddenly I stopped. I could hear something now, something I hadn't heard before. A whisper. But this one wasn't faint. It was clear. "Why are you here?" The voice was soft, chilling like ice on my skin. The words seemed to linger in the air long after they had been spoken, crawling under my skin like a fever. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't tell where it came from, but it felt like it was right next to me. Inside my head. My heart pounded in my ears. "Leave now." The voice grew more urgent, more insistent, as if whatever was speaking didn't want me there, didn't want me to find out whatever lay beyond that door. And then it spoke again, only this time the words were different. "The door is not meant for you." I froze. The door. The one I had just opened. The one that had pulled me in with its invisible force. It wasn't just a door. It was something far older, far more dangerous than I had imagined. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave, to get out of this house and never look back. But the air was thick and it was closing in around me. The shadows were stretching, moving as if they had a mind of their own. I took a step back, my feet dragging across the floor until I hit something. A chair, its wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. My breath caught in my throat and I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. There was nothing. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the light of my phone, something was moving, something darker than the shadows. It was a shape, a silhouette, twisted and bent like a figure crouched low to the ground, its arms stretched out in front of it. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it was waiting for me to notice. My stomach churned, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, couldn't move, couldn't think. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately, dragging itself forward with an awful, scraping sound. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like something was crushing me from all sides. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of this house, but my legs refused to move. The creature, whatever it was, stopped a few feet from me. Its head jerked upward, locking eyes with me in the dim light. Its face was a blur, shifting in the darkness like it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to take. But its eyes, those eyes, were the worst part. They were empty. Hollow, black pits that seemed to stretch on forever, drawing me in, pulling me closer. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything to break the hold it had on me. But I couldn't. My throat was locked tight. I could feel the coldness of the room creeping into my bones, freezing me in place. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the space around me. You shouldn't have come. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. My body was paralyzed, trapped in the room with whatever this thing was. The shadows pressed in, closing around me as the thing began to move again, closer, always closer. It made a low, rasping sound, like a breath drawn through broken lungs. Leave, now. The words were a plea, a command. I don't know why, but I listened. I had to move. My legs finally gave way and I stumbled back, the light from my phone shaking in my hand. I reached for the door. My fingers brushed against the cold, worn knob, and I twisted it, throwing the door open with a violent swing. I ran. I don't remember exactly how I got out, but I remember the feeling of the cold night air rushing against my face as I burst through the front door, stumbling onto the porch. I didn't look back, but even as I stood there, gasping for air, I could feel it. I could feel the presence, whatever it was, still there, still watching me from the dark windows of the house. It wasn't over. It would never be over. And then the whispers followed me. The first thing I did when I ran from that house was to drive. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be far away. My heart was still racing, and every part of me felt exposed, vulnerable. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, watching me from the rearview mirror, from every shadow, from the very air that pressed against the car windows. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't outrun the feeling. I ended up in a small, unfamiliar town, far enough away that it felt like I could breathe again. The town seemed peaceful, nestled between hills and far removed from the chaos of city life. I checked into a cheap motel, hoping the anonymity of it would help me forget the horrors I had just fled. But it didn't. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The sheets felt cold against my skin, and the sounds of the outside world felt muffled, distant. I thought I was safe, but then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint noise, like the creak of old wood. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, but my mind wasn't buying it. The sound grew louder, closer. It was a slow, deliberate creaking like footsteps, heavy ones, and I realized with a sickening certainty that it was coming from the hallway outside my room. I froze. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry. I wanted to turn on the light, to grab my phone, to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My limbs were locked in place, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps continued, each one heavy and slow, as though someone, or something, was walking toward my door. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped outside my room. For a moment there was nothing. No sound. No movement. Just an oppressive silence that filled the air like a weight. Then came the whisper. You didn't leave. It was the same voice, the cold, detached voice that had whispered to me in the house. But this time it was closer. It was right outside the door, just inches away from me. I could almost feel the breath of the words on the other side. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle of the motel door jiggled. My stomach dropped. I could hear the faint scrape of metal against metal as the lock was slowly turned. The door was opening. It was opening. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only lie there, my body stiff, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed. The door creaked open. I thought I heard a breath, deep and ragged, like someone, or something, was standing there just beyond my view. I dared not look. I didn't want to see it, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, like a shadow pressing down on me from all sides. Then suddenly the door slammed shut. I gasped for air, my chest tight, as if the room had been suffocating me. I bolted upright, fumbling for the light switch. The room was empty. There was no one there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection. The full-length mirror on the wall opposite my bed had been cracked when I moved in. A small, hairline crack running from top to bottom, like a spider's web. But now it was shattered. There was no glass on the floor. Instead, I saw someone, moving inside the mirror. A figure, tall and dark, just standing there watching me. Its face was distorted, like a reflection warped by ripples on water, but the eyes, they were the same. Hollow. Empty. The same dark pits that had stared at me from the house. The same gaze that had followed me from room to room, across the hallway, into the dark. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat closed up as I stared at the mirror, transfixed. And then it smiled. A slow, chilling smile that spread across the figure's face like something unnatural, something wrong. The smile was so wide it stretched beyond what seemed possible, contorting the face into something grotesque. I backed away slowly, my legs unsteady. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the room, but the door, it was still locked. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even moved. And then the smile disappeared. The figure was gone. The reflection was gone. I stumbled to the door, throwing it open, only to be met with an empty hallway. I didn't wait to look further. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the cool night air. I don't remember how long I walked. All I remember is that it didn't matter where I went. The feeling never left me. The whispers followed me, just out of earshot, always just behind me, in my mind, in my bones. You can't escape. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the motel. Whatever had followed me was still out there, still watching, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. The worst part was, I knew I'd never be free of it. I'd never be free of the house, of the door, of the thing that lived beyond it. It would follow me forever. I couldn't get away from the house. No matter how far I drove, no matter where I went, the memories clung to me like a cold sweat. Even in the daylight, I could feel the oppressive weight of it all. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, every noise felt a little too loud, and every reflection felt a little too alive. I found myself back in the same town where I'd stayed at the motel, unable to stay anywhere else for long. I hadn't realized how much I had been running until I ran out of places to hide. The house's pull was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I thought about it constantly, the room, the whispers, the strange feeling of being watched. But the thing that haunted me the most was the door to the room. It had been opened, but I hadn't opened it. And that meant there was someone still there, still waiting. I tried to ignore it, but the nightmares wouldn't stop. They were vivid, terrifying dreams where I was trapped in that house again, but worse. Each time I tried to leave, the door would close behind me, and I'd hear it, the slow, deliberate creaking of footsteps, getting closer, until they were right behind me. When I finally found an apartment, one that wasn't too far from the town, but just far enough that I thought I'd be safe, I thought I could start over. I was wrong. It started with the smell. A faint, rotting odor that seemed to hang in the air at all times. I kept the windows open, tried cleaning every inch of the apartment, but nothing worked. The smell wouldn't go away. I even thought it might just be my imagination or some hidden leak in the walls. But I knew better. Then I heard the noises. At first, it was just the sound of creaking floorboards in the middle of the night. I told myself it was the building settling, that it was nothing more than the usual creaks and groans of an old structure. But the noises became more specific, more intentional. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate steps that echoed down the hall, coming closer, then stopping outside my door. I knew it was happening again. The door wasn't just a metaphor. It was a real, tangible presence that had followed me. It wasn't just in the house anymore. It had attached itself to me, and now it was here. One evening, I decided to confront it. I stood in the hallway, listening to the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the other end. The closer they got, the more my heart pounded. It felt like the air around me thickened, making it hard to breathe. When the footsteps stopped outside my apartment door, I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body gripped by the same terror that had paralyzed me in that house. I wanted to look through the peephole to see if anyone was there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The thought of seeing something on the other side, something that shouldn't be there, made my stomach churn. I reached for the doorknob, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. But before I could turn it, the door opened. I didn't open it. It opened on its own. Standing in the doorway was nothing but darkness. Pure black, impenetrable. The air in the apartment grew colder, and I felt a chill slide down my spine. And then I heard the whisper. The same voice. You thought you could escape. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. My fingers fumbled for the lock, but I didn't trust it anymore. I backed away, my eyes scanning the apartment, desperate for any sign of movement, any indication of where it had come from. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that whatever was behind that door was still there, waiting. And I knew it wouldn't stop. I started searching the apartment. The closet, the windows, even the bathroom. But I couldn't find anything out of place. The apartment was eerily still. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then I noticed something. In the mirror above the sink, I saw it. A faint outline, something shifting in the reflection. A figure just behind me. It was tall and shadowed, its features indistinct but unmistakable. Its presence was overwhelming, like a dark cloud pressing against the glass. I spun around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the reflection of the empty room. But I could still feel it. The thing was here. It had followed me from the house, and now it was in my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The footsteps continued, creeping down the hall, pacing back and forth outside my door. Each time I closed my eyes, I could see the dark figure in the reflection, waiting for me to look away so it could move. I knew I had to leave. But where could I go? I couldn't keep running forever. And then it came to me. The door. The door was the key. Whatever was haunting me had entered through that house's door, and it was still there in that place, waiting to be opened again. I needed to go back. I needed to confront it head-on, face to face. I wasn't sure if I was brave enough, but I knew there was no other choice. The house had a hold on me. It wasn't just a building, it was a prison, and I had to return to it to break free. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. The engine roared to life as I sped down the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel with such force that my fingers ached. I didn't dare look back at the house, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching from the distance. The reflection of its windows in my rearview mirror seemed to pulse with a sinister glow, as if the house itself was alive, aware of my escape. I wasn't sure where I was going, or even if I was really going anywhere. My mind was a jumble of fear and confusion, swirling in a fog that wouldn't lift. But there was one thing I knew for certain: I couldn't go back. Not ever. But I couldn't escape the feeling that I hadn't truly left. The next few days were a blur. I didn't sleep, not properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the house, its dark silhouette looming in my mind. I heard the whispers again, soft and distant, calling to me. But every time I opened my eyes, the world around me was unchanged. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. And yet, the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I tried to tell myself that I was safe, that it was over. But deep down, I knew better. I started to notice things, small things, around my apartment that didn't quite make sense. The creaking of the floorboards when no one was there. The cold drafts that swept through rooms without explanation. But it was the sound that got to me. The soft tapping, like someone knocking on a door from far away. It was never loud enough to investigate, but always there, like a persistent reminder of what I had left behind. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or if it was something worse. One evening, I decided to visit the library. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had a feeling I might find something. Some clue that could explain everything that had happened. I needed to know the history of that house, the truth of what I had walked into. The library was quiet when I arrived. The air smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of place where secrets lingered in the corners of every shelf. I wandered through the aisles, my fingers grazing over the spines of books, until something caught my eye. A faded, leather-bound journal, tucked away in the corner of the local history section. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellowed with age, but it had an aura about it, something that called to me. I pulled it from the shelf, my heart racing as I opened the first page. The handwriting was old but legible. The words flowed in a shaky script, as though the author was uncertain about what they were writing, or perhaps unsure of whether they should be writing it at all. The name at the top of the page stopped me cold. Eliza Rayner. I knew that name. It was the name of the house's original owner, the one who had been obsessed with the occult, the one who had vanished without a trace years before, the one who had left the house to its cursed fate. The journal detailed strange rituals, incomprehensible passages about doors, realms, and the dangers of what lay beyond. I skimmed through the pages, feeling the weight of each word, as if the journal itself was pulling me deeper into its web. But it was the last entry that chilled me to my core. Asterisk, the door has been opened. The thing is awake. The watches waits, and I fear it is not content. I do not know how to close it. Asterisk. The last words were smudged, as though the writer had been in a hurry, or perhaps, in the midst of something more sinister. The air in the library seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how empty the place felt, how silent. Then I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps, echoing from somewhere behind me. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. The library was as quiet as it had been when I entered, save for the rustle of pages turning in my hands. But something wasn't right. I didn't stay long after that. I left the journal on the table and walked out of the library, my mind racing. The footsteps, the whispering, it was all connected. but I didn't understand how. Not yet. As I stepped into the cold night air, I felt it again, a presence, a weight in the air. Something watching me from the shadows. It followed me all the way to my car, and only when I slammed the door shut did I feel a brief flicker of relief. But it didn't last. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide from it. Whatever had been unleashed in that house was still here, still waiting. The door was still open, and I wasn't sure if I could close it before it claimed me. The night after my trip to the library, I didn't sleep at all. My mind was a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and creeping dread. Every corner of my apartment felt like it was closing in on me. The walls seemed too close, the air too heavy. And the worst part? I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, someone was watching me, waiting for me to slip, to let my guard down. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. That I was just jumping at shadows, the product of too much stress, too much fear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something more to it. Something that wasn't finished. I stayed up, pacing, trying to focus on anything other than the house. The cursed house. I had to know what had happened there, what Eliza Rayner had uncovered, and whether there was anything left to salvage. But as the night dragged on, I realized I was only delaying the inevitable. I had to go back. I had to face whatever waited for me there. The next day I returned to the house, but something felt different this time. The air was heavier, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The house, once so silent, seemed alive, breathing, shifting in subtle ways that sent shivers crawling up my spine. The creaking floorboards under my feet sounded louder now, as though the house was warning me. I stood in the hallway for a long time, the weight of the place pressing down on me. Then I heard it, soft footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the floor above. I froze. My heart skipped a beat and my throat went dry. It wasn't the house settling. This was something else. Something alive. I slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The noise seemed louder now, more urgent, as though something, or someone, was waiting for me. The cold drafts brushed against my skin, but they felt different now. They were no longer just chilling breezes, they were warnings. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I reached the top of the stairs. I took a deep breath, pushing open the door to the room where I'd first encountered the strange, unseen presence. The room looked unchanged, but I knew better. It was never just a room, it was a doorway, a portal, and it was still open. As I stepped inside, I felt a weight on my chest, as if the very air was pressing down on me. The shadows seemed to gather in the corners, darker than they had ever been before. And then, just as I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was barely a shape, a dark silhouette that seemed to pulse with malice. The air around it shimmered, cold and thick, as if the room itself was rejecting its presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air was thick with an unspoken threat, one that clawed at my sanity, one that whispered that I was too late, that I had already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Suddenly I heard a voice. Not from the figure, but from somewhere deep within the house. It was faint at first, a low murmur that sent a chill down my spine. Then it grew louder, more distinct. You should have stayed away. The voice wasn't human. It was wrong. It was a hiss, like something trying to force its way into the world, but trapped, twisted, and distorted by whatever was on the other side of that door. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The room went dark, the shadows closing in like a vice. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing. The temperature dropped, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, into my bones, freezing me in place. And then the bed shifted. I felt it first, the shift in weight, the slight dip in the mattress beside me, as though something, or someone, had just sat down. I didn't dare open my eyes. I could feel it though. The pressure, the presence sitting there in the dark with me. Breathing, waiting. Leave, the voice whispered, its tone low and guttural, like a growl from the depths of the earth. You cannot fight what you have already awakened. I snapped my eyes open, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just the same dark, empty room. But the feeling, the oppressive weight of something watching me, waiting for me to make a move, didn't leave. It stayed. It pressed against me. In that moment, I knew I was trapped. There was no way out. The house had claimed me just like it had claimed Eliza Rayner, just like it had claimed every other soul that had come before me. I stumbled to my feet, gasping for air, my pulse racing. The shadows closed in, but I didn't care. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I could still hear the whispers, faint at first but growing louder in my ears. I could still feel the presence, the thing that had been awakened. But as I looked back at the house, at the dark windows staring back at me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't free. I hadn't escaped. Not really. Because whatever had been unleashed in that house wasn't finished yet, and it was still waiting. I didn't sleep for days after my return from the house. The nightmares were relentless, crawling into my mind like a virus, infecting every moment of my waking life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the corner of the room, felt the bed shift beneath me, heard the whispers of the thing that had been awakened. It was always there, just out of reach, always waiting for me to slip up, to show weakness. I couldn't stay in my apartment anymore. It wasn't safe. The creeping sensation, the cold drafts, the footsteps that never stopped following me, it was too much. But I had nowhere else to go. No one to turn to. I tried calling the authorities, but they'd laughed at me, dismissed my claims as the ramblings of a terrified person. The house was just old, they said. Just another abandoned building with a bit of history. Nothing sinister. Nothing dangerous. But I knew better. I had felt it. That thing in the house, that presence, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it wasn't done with me yet. I tried to drown out the voices, the fear, with normalcy. I went to work, forced myself to socialize, pretending everything was fine, even though the fear gnawed at my insides like a hungry animal. But it never let up. The whispers followed me wherever I went, a constant hum in the back of my mind. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was always there. And every time I passed an old building, every time I saw a house with windows that stared back at me, I couldn't help but feel the pull, the call. I couldn't shake the thought that I had left something unfinished, something important. The door that had been opened in that house had never truly closed. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I knew it would eventually catch up with me. So I went back. I knew I shouldn't. I knew that whatever was waiting for me inside that house wasn't something I could handle. But the need to understand, to find some sort of closure, drove me back. I wasn't going to let it haunt me forever. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened, what Eliza Rayner had done, and what had been unleashed. The house looked just as it had the first time I saw it, a dark silhouette against the gray sky. But this time the air felt different. There was a stillness to it, a heaviness that weighed down on everything, making the world feel too small, too close. I walked up to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The handle was cold under my fingers, but the door creaked open without resistance, as if it had been expecting me. Inside, the house was dark, the only light coming from the thin slivers of daylight that filtered through the boarded-up windows. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic like blood. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, swirling in the corners, waiting for me to step into them. I moved cautiously through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The floorboards groaned under my weight, protesting with every step. I made my way upstairs, the same stairs that had creaked with every footfall before. And when I reached the top, I felt it, the coldness, the heaviness. The presence was here, stronger than ever, its grip tightening around my chest. I opened the door to the room where it had all started, the room that had once been a sanctuary for Eliza Rayner and her dark rituals. It was empty now, save for the remnants of old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there, in the corner, was the unmistakable mark, the sigil, the symbol that had been etched into the floor. I knelt down, my fingers brushing over the faded lines, and I felt it, an electric charge, a pulse. It was still there, still alive, still waiting. I didn't know what I expected to find. A clue maybe, a way to undo what had been done. But as I stared at the sigil, a thought hit me, sharp and sudden. What if there was no undoing it? What if it had been too late from the moment Eliza Rayner opened that door? I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers started again, louder this time, more urgent. They were calling me, pulling me toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to writhe and shift. I could feel the temperature drop, the air thickening around me. And then I heard it, a voice, but not from the shadows. It was coming from the other side of the room, from the doorway. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come back. Asterisk, I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, slowly, to face the figure standing in the doorway. It was Eliza Rayner. Her eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had been drained of all light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes were tattered, as though time had eroded them into nothing. She didn't speak again, but the message was clear. Asterisk, it's too late. Asterisk. I backed up toward the door, my pulse racing. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before it was too late. But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut. The room spun around me, the shadows thickening, closing in. The whispers were deafening now, the voices of those who had come before me, those who had fallen victim to whatever dark force had been summoned here. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no leaving. There was no escape. The house wasn't done with me. It would never be done. I was just another part of its story. Another soul to be consumed by the darkness. And there would always be another, just as there had always been before. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last, because once the door is opened, it never truly closes. I don't know how long I stayed in that house. Time seemed irrelevant in the suffocating grip of the darkness. Could have been hours. Could have been days. Everything blurred together. My mind, my senses, everything twisted into a haze, distorted by the presence that surrounded me. Eliza Rayner's hollow eyes never left me. She stood there, motionless, as the whispers of the house grew louder, echoing around me like 1,000 voices screaming in unison. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my body. My skin felt clammy, but the chill inside me was far worse. It was as if the air itself was suffocating me. I couldn't breathe properly. The weight in the room, the oppressive silence, had turned into something physical. My chest felt crushed beneath it, and the world spun faster, threatening to tear me apart. I stumbled back, but I couldn't escape. The door wouldn't open. The room seemed to stretch, the walls growing taller, narrowing in on me. The shadows in the corners shifted as if they were alive, moving in ways that no shadow should. They reached for me, their forms becoming more distinct, more defined. The whispers changed. No longer were they just words. They were commands, orders. I felt them seep into my thoughts, twisting them, altering them. Asterisk, stay. You belong here. Don't run. Asterisk. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. No, I had to escape. I had to leave. But the shadows were closing in on me, crawling up my legs, pulling me down into the floor itself. The cold fingers of whatever haunted this house wrapped around my ankles, pulling harder with every movement I made. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the house. The groans, the moans, the sound of something moving beneath the floorboards. It was no longer just a house. It was alive. It had a heartbeat, a pulse, and I was its prey. Eliza, she was still there, watching me. Her mouth twitched, a sinister smile forming. I tried to run again, but I was paralyzed, frozen in place by the weight of her gaze. The shadows had fully engulfed my legs now, pulling me deeper, dragging me into the floor. The walls seemed to close in tighter. And then I heard it. A loud bang, followed by the creaking of the house, as if something massive was moving just beneath me. I looked down and saw the floorboards buckling under the pressure. Something was pushing its way up from beneath the house, something large, something monstrous. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of something ancient and malevolent. Suddenly the room shifted. The walls seemed to split apart, the house itself groaning as if it was trying to break free. I felt the pressure ease for just a moment, enough for me to stagger forward, gasping for air. My legs felt weak, my vision blurred. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and indistinct, emerging from the cracks in the floor. It was no longer just Eliza standing in the doorway. No, something far worse had awakened, something older, darker, and far more terrifying. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. The figure wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, for this very moment. Its form shifted like smoke, but with a mass, a weight that couldn't be denied. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my breaths coming in sharp, painful gasps. The thing stepped forward, its presence filling the room, suffocating every inch of space. It reached for me. Its hand, a twisted amalgamation of shadows and bone, brushed my face, and I could feel the coldness of its touch burn into my skin. Asterisk, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, asterisk, I thought, but the words were swallowed by the darkness. The house was alive, its hunger endless. There was no escape. The door I had come through had already shut behind me, sealing me inside. There would be no way out. No rescue. Only darkness, only whispers, only the endless pull of whatever was waiting to claim me. As my vision began to fade, I realized the truth of it all. I wasn't the first person to step into this house, and I wouldn't be the last. The thing that haunted it, whatever it was, wasn't just a ghost. It was a force. A presence that fed on the living, that tore through time and space, waiting for someone new to cross its threshold. It had chosen me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The last thing I remember was the feeling of being pulled deeper into the house. The last breath I took was cold, filled with the suffocating taste of dust and fear. And then, nothing. I'm still here, somewhere, in the darkness, waiting. And if you listen closely, you might hear my whispers too. The house is still hungry and it's waiting for someone new. It's never truly empty. Story 3. I had never been the type to believe in superstitions or haunted houses, but there I was, standing in front of an old, creaky house I had just moved into. The boxes were scattered around the living room, half unpacked, and the smell of dust and old wood hung in the air. It was everything I had imagined it would be: creaky floorboards, ancient wallpaper peeling from the walls, and a general sense of abandonment that came with a house that had seen better days. I had only just moved to this small town a few weeks ago, hoping that a fresh start would help me move on from everything. The divorce had been tough, and I needed a place where I could find peace. The house, though weathered and aged, had its charm, if you squinted hard enough and didn't mind the constant noise of old houses settling. It had been on the market for months, and when I saw the price, I couldn't resist. It was within my budget, and I figured the house's age would give it some character. What could go wrong? I sighed and started dragging the first box towards the small bedroom upstairs. The place had been vacant for a while, and the real estate agent had mentioned that the previous tenants had left in a hurry, but they didn't go into details. Maybe it was a case of bad luck or just the house's disrepair pushing them to leave. It wasn't until I bumped into Mrs. Hayes, the neighbor from across the street, that I heard the first whispers of the house's unsettling past. "Oh, you've moved in," she said with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause. "You must be new to town, dear. I haven't seen anyone live there for quite a while. It's a lovely house, though it has its quirks." I smiled politely. "Yeah, it's been a bit of a project so far, but I think I'll settle in fine." "Well," she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if making sure no one else was listening. "The last tenants? Well, they didn't stay long. They were good people, I suppose. But something strange happened. You see, the house has a history." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "History?" "Oh yes," she said, lowering her voice. "People say it's haunted. Not the kind of ghost you see, mind you. It's more like an energy. Some folks say they hear footsteps when no one's around. Others claim they saw someone running out of the house, pale as a ghost, babbling about curses. It's all rumors, of course, but I thought you should know." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't tell if she was trying to be helpful or if she was enjoying watching me squirm. "Sounds like local legends," I replied, shrugging it off. Mrs. Hayes didn't seem convinced. "You just be careful. Old houses like that, well, they carry their past with them. You might want to do some research, maybe find out more about the house's original owner. He was peculiar from what I understand." Before I could ask her anything more, she gave me a tight smile and turned to leave. "Good luck, dear. I'll be around if you need anything." I stood there for a moment, staring at the house. Mrs. Hayes had said the house was peculiar, and something about her tone made me uneasy. I tried to push the thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just the stress of moving. Old houses creaked and groaned, especially if they hadn't been lived in for a while. It was normal, right? That night, as I unpacked the last of the boxes, the house started to settle into its own rhythm. The old floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked across the room. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and I could hear the soft sound of something shifting in the walls. The house was alive in its own way, and I felt its presence wrap around me, almost as if it was welcoming me. I went to bed that night, the house still as strange and unfamiliar as it had been earlier. The bed was creaky, the mattress thin and lumpy, but I was exhausted from the move. As I closed my eyes, the familiar sounds of the house settled in: creaking wood, the rustle of the wind, and the occasional soft groan of something ancient and tired. But then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it. Heavy footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone walking just outside my door. I sat up in bed, heart racing, but the house was silent once more. I waited a few moments, listening, but there was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. It was just the house settling. With a sigh, I lay back down, brushing it off. The house was old, and old houses had noises. That's all it was. Nothing more. But the sound of those footsteps lingered in my mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. Tomorrow I'd go to the library, do a little research about the house's past, just to put my mind at ease. The next morning came too quickly. My body was exhausted from the move, but my mind kept turning, replaying the sounds of the night. I knew I had to shake it off. After all, it was just a house, right? But the footsteps hadn't felt like something natural. They had felt deliberate, like they were meant to be heard. The sun was barely up when I made my way to the local library. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the library was no different. Mrs. Hayes had been right about one thing. The house had a history, and it was one I couldn't ignore. I'd spent a few hours combing through dusty old newspapers, researching the house's past owners. The name of the original owner kept popping up: Victor Bellamy. The name alone sounded ominous, like it belonged to someone who had lived in a different time. I found an old newspaper article from the late 1800s, detailing a fire that had destroyed a part of the house and killed several people. But that was just the beginning. According to the article, Victor Bellamy had been a reclusive man, known for his eccentricities. He had no family, no close friends, and no real ties to the outside world. It wasn't until after his death that strange things started happening in the house. Neighbors had reported seeing lights flicker in the windows at night and hearing voices when no one was around. Some even claimed they saw shadows moving behind the curtains, though no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave the house. As I read, a sense of unease began to settle in my stomach. This wasn't just an old house with a few creaky floorboards. There was something off about it, something that didn't quite fit. I decided to go back home and continue my search, hoping to find something more concrete. The rest of the day passed slowly. I spent hours going through old journals and documents that had been left behind in the attic. Most of it was just junk: old furniture, dusty boxes of clothes, and stacks of newspapers from decades ago. But as I dug deeper, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a small leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places, but the words were still legible. The handwriting was frantic, almost like someone had been in a rush to write it all down. The first page was dated April 15, 1912. I sat down on the floor, the journal heavy in my hands. The first few entries were mundane, like the daily musings of a man who had little to occupy his time. But as I turned the pages, the tone began to shift. I hear them again. One entry read, "They're coming for me. I can't escape them. I've tried everything, prayers, charms, and even burning the sacred herbs. But nothing works. The house is alive. It's calling me." The further I read, the more disturbing it became. Victor Bellamy had been obsessed with the occult. He had performed rituals in the house, rituals meant to open a door to the unknown. His entries spoke of strange occurrences, voices whispering in the walls, cold drafts in rooms with no open windows, and the feeling of being watched. But it was the last entry that truly sent a chill down my spine. "I think I've opened the door. I've seen it now. I've seen what's on the other side. It's not a thing of this world. It's waiting for me. It's waiting for all of us." The last words were a jumbled mess of symbols, too distorted to make any sense of, as if Victor had been trying to write something, but his hand had failed him. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I had to get out of that house. I had to leave before whatever Victor Bellamy had let loose found its way to me. But as I glanced at the clock, I realized it was already getting late. I couldn't leave just yet. I wasn't ready. The house had already gotten under my skin, and something told me that I couldn't just walk away. Not without knowing what had truly happened here. That night, the house seemed quieter than usual. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards. I thought I could finally get some sleep, but as I lay in bed, my mind kept returning to the journal, to the words Victor had written, to the door he had opened. Suddenly, a loud thud from downstairs startled me. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It was the unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the floor. At first, I thought maybe it was a piece of furniture, but the house didn't shift like that. No, this was something else. I slowly stood up and tiptoed to the top of the stairs, straining my ears to listen. There was silence again, but the air felt thick, like something was just waiting to happen. Then, as if on cue, I heard it, the same heavy footsteps from the night before. Only this time they weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from the stairs. The sound of slow, deliberate steps echoed up from below as if someone, or something, was climbing toward me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever was in this house, whatever Victor Bellamy had unleashed, was real, and it was coming for me. I stood frozen at the top of the stairs, the hairs on my neck prickling as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They weren't just footsteps. They were a presence, a heavy, measured tread, as if someone, was determined to reach me. My pulse quickened and my mind raced to make sense of it. I should have been running. I should have been out the door, down the stairs, and gone. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed by fear and confusion, listening to the sound of footsteps that didn't belong. They stopped just at the foot of the stairs. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the quiet creak of the old house settling. Then, almost imperceptibly, the air grew colder. I could feel the temperature drop, the warmth leaving the room, replaced by an unnatural chill that made my breath visible in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows at the bottom of the stairs. I don't know how long I stood there, but the silence was unbearable. The weight of whatever was lurking below pressed down on me, suffocating. I strained to hear even the smallest sound, but all that came was the faint, rhythmic creaking of the house as if it was alive and watching. And then the whispering started. It was soft at first, almost like the rustling of leaves or the faintest murmur of voices in a distant room. But as it grew, I could make out words, though they were too faint to understand. They weren't coming from the house itself. No, they were coming from within me, like a thought that wasn't mine, an echo of something buried deep in the walls. I couldn't focus on it, couldn't make sense of it. The whispers seemed to slip away every time I tried to listen. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my throat tightened with terror. The presence was right there, just beyond the corner of my vision, watching, waiting. It was then that I realized something even more terrifying. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, something moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong, that had no business being in my house. It was waiting for me to move, to make a sound, to give it a reason to show itself. I backed away from the top of the stairs, heart hammering, until my back hit the wall. My mind screamed at me to get out of there, to leave the house, but my legs felt like stone, heavy and immovable. The whispers turned into a hiss. "Come down," it seemed to say. "Come to us." I stumbled backward into my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was in the house. The air in the room felt suffocating now, thick with the same oppressive cold. The bed creaked as I sat down, but I didn't dare lie down. I kept my eyes on the door, waiting for it to burst open, for whatever was out there to come in and claim me. I had to get out. I knew that now. But as my mind raced through every possible way to escape, I heard something even worse. A soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wood, coming from the door. I stood up, adrenaline flooding my system. I couldn't stay here. I had to find the keys, leave, and never come back. The scratching grew louder. It wasn't just at the door anymore. Now it was on the walls, scratching, scraping, moving around the room as if something was pacing in the shadows just out of sight. I felt the blood drain from my face and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. Get out. I spun around, eyes wide, searching for a way out. The window was my only option. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it was stuck. The window didn't budge. Panic surged in my chest as I slammed my fists against it, but nothing. It wouldn't open. I could still hear the scraping, and now a low growl like an animal waiting to pounce. It wasn't coming from outside. It was in the room with me, breathing in the dark. The sound was so close now that I could feel it vibrating through my bones. And then, without warning, the door to my room flew open with a violent force. The cold air rushed in, and I saw it, just for a second, standing in the doorway. It was tall, shadowy, its outline blurred like it was part of the darkness itself. Its eyes were glowing faintly, two pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce through the blackness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it stepped into the room, its presence filling every corner, every inch of the space. The scraping, the growling, it all stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. It took a step toward me. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted for the door, throwing myself down the stairs, my feet slipping on the worn wood. The house seemed to come alive beneath me, groaning, shifting as if trying to stop me. The darkness behind me was closing in, the shadows stretching long and twisting in unnatural ways. I could hear the faint scratching again, like claws on wood, getting closer and closer. I didn't look back as I ran out the door, stumbling into the yard. My breath came in gasps, my body trembling with fear. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent now, but I knew, that whatever had been inside was still there, waiting. The town felt cold as I stood there in the yard, unsure of what to do next. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't go back inside. The whispers, the footsteps, the growls, they would follow me. I wasn't safe. None of us were. I glanced back at the house one last time before running down the street, but as I did, I swear I saw something in the window, a pair of glowing eyes watching me leave. And for the first time since moving here, I didn't feel alone anymore. I couldn't sleep that night. I had no intention of ever going back to that house, but something inside me refused to let go of the terrible images that still haunted my mind. The feeling of those glowing eyes watching me followed me everywhere. Even the moonlit streets felt unnaturally still, as if the town itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had to know more. The house, its history, its curse, had become a gnawing obsession. I couldn't let it go. Despite everything that had happened, despite the terror that still gripped my chest, I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened, what was still happening in that house. The next morning, after barely managing to rest, I found myself standing in front of the town library. I had no idea where to start, but the building itself seemed like a place where I might uncover something. Its stone facade looked ancient, with ivy crawling up its walls as if nature itself wanted to reclaim it. It was the kind of library that felt like it had secrets of its own, secrets buried under layers of dust and time. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and wood. The quiet was deafening, as if the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb its peace. I made my way to the desk, where a woman in her late 50s sat, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked at me as I approached, her expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and careful. I swallowed. "I'm looking for information on a house in town. It's on Ashford Street, the old one. The one with the strange history." Her eyes narrowed, and she seemed to hesitate for a moment before responding. "Ashford Street, you say? You're not the first to come asking about that place. It's been abandoned for years now, but before that, it had a history. A dark one." I didn't have to say anything. She must have seen something in my face, an understanding or maybe a shared sense of dread, because she motioned for me to follow her. She led me down a narrow aisle to the back of the library, past rows of dusty shelves and forgotten books. At the very end, she stopped and pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume. The cover was faded and worn, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. "This is the town's history," she said, placing the book in front of me. "It has everything, every incident, every story that's shaped this place. The house you're asking about, it's all here." I opened the book, my heart pounding as I flipped through the pages. The first few chapters were filled with old photographs and town records, but it wasn't until I reached a section titled The Ashford House that the true story began to reveal itself. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Edward Ashford, a wealthy landowner who had moved to the area with his family. He had been an eccentric man, known for his interest in the occult and the supernatural. He had hired a group of mysterious individuals, called the Circle, to help him conduct rituals in the house. There were rumors that he had been trying to open a doorway to another world, to summon something that could grant him immortality, wealth, and power. As the years went on, the stories of strange occurrences in the house became more frequent. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night, and there were whispers of strange lights coming from the windows. The Ashford family was never seen again after a fire destroyed part of the house, but the fire was never fully explained. Some believed it was an accident, while others thought it was a failed ritual gone horribly wrong. I continued reading, my fingers trembling as I turned the pages. The final entry was a journal excerpt from one of Edward Ashford's last days in the house, dated just days before the fire. It described a final, desperate attempt to open the door to the other world, a door that had been sealed for decades. His handwriting was shaky, erratic. "I've done it. I've opened it. The door is ajar and I can hear them now. They whisper to me, promise me things. Power beyond imagination. But the price is steep. They are not pleased. They want something from me, something I cannot give. I fear that I will be their price. But it is too late to turn back now." The journal ended abruptly, and the last page was torn as if someone had ripped it out in a panic. I sat back, my mind reeling. So it was true. The house had been cursed, and whatever Edward Ashford had opened had never been fully closed. I wasn't just hearing things. The footsteps, the cold spots, the whispers, they were all connected to whatever lay behind that door. And now I had unwittingly walked into it. I closed the book, the weight of what I had learned sinking into me. I could feel my pulse racing, the air thick with the oppressive sense of something unseen watching me. I had to get out of there. I had to get away from this place, but I didn't know if it would even matter. The house had already reached out to me, and I wasn't sure there was any escape. As I turned to leave, the librarian's voice stopped me. "You're not the first," she said, her tone lower now, almost a whisper. "Many have come before you searching for answers. But they never leave. The house, it has a way of claiming those who try to understand it. Be careful. Once it knows you, it won't let go." I nodded, the chill running down my spine, a stark reminder of how little I truly understood. The house had claimed its previous tenants, and now it was calling to me. I left the library with the weight of Edward Ashford's journal haunting me. The quiet streets of the town felt emptier than ever, as if the world around me had shifted slightly, tilting everything into an uneasy balance. The sun was setting by the time I reached my car, and the long shadows stretched across the pavement seemed unnaturally sharp, like claw marks raking across the ground. The librarian's words echoed in my mind. Once it knows you, it won't let go. Driving back to the house felt like willingly stepping into a trap. I debated not returning at all, but where else could I go? My belongings were there, my life was there, what little of it I had cobbled together since moving here. Besides, some part of me felt tethered to the house as if it were pulling me back, its invisible threads tightening with every mile I drove. When I finally arrived, the house loomed against the darkening sky, its silhouette jagged and foreboding. The broken shutters clattered faintly in the wind, and the air felt heavier, colder as I stepped out of the car. I unlocked the front door with shaky hands, the key scraping awkwardly against the metal as I fumbled. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The house was different. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the drafty chill. It was a presence, thick and unyielding, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. The air itself seemed charged, crackling with a tension I couldn't place. I set my bag down in the entryway and closed the door behind me, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. For a moment I stood there, listening, holding my breath. The silence wasn't empty. It had depth, layers of faint sounds I couldn't quite decipher. Whispers, maybe, or the faint rustle of movement. I forced myself to move, to act normal. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me after reading about Edward Ashford and his rituals. Maybe the house wasn't as alive as it felt. But as I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy and deliberate, they echoed from the second floor. I froze, the glass halfway to my lips. My heart pounded in my chest, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, the edges of my vision blurring. The footsteps came again, this time closer. The rational part of my brain screamed for me to leave, to get out of the house and never look back. But something deeper, something primal, rooted me to the spot. I couldn't move. Then came the whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, a soft, rasping voice speaking words I couldn't understand. The sound slithered down my spine like cold fingers. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and thunderous, as I stood there, clutching the counter for support. Then from the top of the stairs came a loud bang. The noise snapped me out of my paralysis, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the glass in my hand. My eyes darted toward the staircase, the darkness at the top impenetrable and yawning like an open maw. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and forced myself to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flashlight's beam wavered as my hands shook, illuminating the walls and floor as I made my way to the stairs. The sound had come from the master bedroom, the door now slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response. I stepped inside, the beam of light sweeping across the room. Everything was as I had left it. The unmade bed, the boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, the dresser against the far wall. But then I saw it. On the floor in the center of the room was the journal. I hadn't brought it back with me. It was still in the library, or at least it should have been. Yet here it was, the leather cover scuffed and worn as if it had been there for decades. I bent down slowly, my breath hitching as I picked it up. The pages were blank. Every single one of them wiped clean as if the words had never existed. A cold gust of air swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight cutting through the dark, but the room was empty. The air felt colder now, biting against my skin, and the faint sound of whispering began again, circling me like a predator. My flashlight flickered. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. The whispering stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, the room was utterly still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow that didn't belong stretching across the wall. It wasn't mine. The shadow shifted, growing larger, its form twisting into something unnatural. It loomed over me, and I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like a void swallowing all the light and warmth in the room. The flashlight died. In the pitch-black darkness, I felt it move closer. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of burning wood filled my nostrils. A voice, low and guttural, spoke directly into my ear. "Why are you here?" I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the journal. My hands clawed at the door, desperate to escape, and after what felt like an eternity, I managed to wrench it open. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my face. I collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The house stood silent behind me, its windows dark and lifeless. But I knew it was watching. It was waiting. and I wasn't sure I could leave it behind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car, parked across the street from the house, clutching a blanket and a coffee I didn't remember making. Every creak of the wind, every rustle of the leaves, made my heart jump. The house loomed in the dark, its windows black and unblinking, like empty eye sockets staring directly at me. I wanted to leave, to drive away and never look back. But I didn't. Something about the house wouldn't let me. Or maybe it was me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been chosen somehow, dragged into this nightmare for a reason. When the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I finally forced myself to move. My body ached from sitting in the car all night, and the coffee had turned cold in my hands. I stared at the house, at its crooked silhouette framed against the pale orange sky. It looked almost normal in the daylight, as if mocking me for my fear. I decided to go back inside. The moment I stepped through the front door, I felt the shift again. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy that pressed against my chest. But now there was something new, a low hum, almost imperceptible, like the faint vibration of a far-off machine. I stood in the entryway, listening, my pulse quickening. "Okay," I muttered to myself, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You're not going to scare me out of my own house." But as I moved through the rooms, I realized the house wasn't the same. In the living room, the wallpaper had peeled back further, revealing strange markings etched into the plaster beneath. They weren't random scratches or wear from age. They were deliberate, intricate symbols that seemed to twist and writhe when I looked at them too long. The kitchen was colder than it should have been, even with the windows shut tight. The faint smell of burning wood lingered in the air, clinging to my clothes and hair. Upstairs, the master bedroom door was open again, despite me slamming it shut the night before. I approached it slowly, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand even though it was broad daylight. Inside, the room was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The journal was back on the floor. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The last time I'd seen it, its pages had been wiped clean, stripped of Edward Ashford's words. But now, as I picked it up, I saw that the pages weren't blank anymore. New words had appeared, scrawled in jagged handwriting that wasn't Edward's. Asterisk, "It knows you now. You can't run." Asterisk. The journal slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, this isn't happening. But it was. The hum I'd heard earlier grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls vibrated faintly, and the air around me seemed to thrum with it, like the house itself was alive. I ran downstairs, my heart racing. My first instinct was to leave, to grab my keys and drive until I couldn't see the house anymore. But as I reached the front door, I stopped. Something was standing in the doorway. It wasn't a person, not exactly. Its form was tall and distorted, its edges flickering like a flame caught in the wind. Its face, if it had one, was a void, an emptiness that seemed to pull at me, drawing me closer. I froze, my hand gripping the doorknob so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking my escape, its presence radiating a cold so intense it burned. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if considering me. Then, in a voice that was both many in one, it spoke. Asterisk, "Stay." Asterisk. The word echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull like a bell. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But then the figure stepped back, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there. The door was open. I didn't think, I just ran. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I turned back, expecting to see the house watching me, but it stood there, silent and still, its windows dark and empty. For a moment I thought I was free. But then I heard it. The hum. It was faint, almost lost in the noise of the wind and the distant sound of traffic. But it was there, following me, whispering at the edges of my mind. I knew then that leaving the house wouldn't be enough. It had marked me, and it wasn't done with me yet. I spent the rest of the day at a nearby diner, nursing a cup of coffee that I barely touched. The din of clattering dishes and idle conversation was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The figure, the journal, the hum, it all felt like a fever dream, something I could dismiss as stress or exhaustion if it weren't for the faint bruises on my wrist where I'd gripped the doorknob so tightly. My mind replayed the events over and over, as if trying to find some explanation that wouldn't unravel the threads of my sanity. I didn't go back to the house that night. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel a few miles away. The clerk didn't even look up as I handed him cash and mumbled something about needing a room for the night. The room was as grim as I felt, peeling wallpaper, a flickering fluorescent light, and a bedspread that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was safe, or at least safer than the house. I bolted the door and shoved a chair beneath the handle for good measure. Then I collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling as the hum from the house echoed in my mind. It was well past midnight when I finally drifted off, but my sleep was anything but peaceful. The dream came suddenly, vivid and sharp. I was back in the house, standing in the living room. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and something else, something metallic and sharp like blood. The walls seemed to close in around me, the symbols beneath the peeling wallpaper glowing faintly in the dim light. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, slipping between the cracks in the walls like water. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. A voice whispered in my ear, low and guttural, "Asterisk, it's already inside you." Asterisk. I woke with a gasp, my body drenched in sweat. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. The motel room spun around me, and it took everything I had to remember that I'd left the house. But as I sat there, catching my breath, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the inside of my wrist, just beneath the skin, was a faint mark. It was one of the symbols from the house, etched into my flesh like a brand. I scrubbed at it with the corner of the motel's thin, scratchy towel until my skin was raw, but the mark didn't fade. It was a part of me now. The next morning, I decided I couldn't face this alone anymore. I needed answers, and the only person who seemed to know anything about the house was the old man I'd met on the day I moved in. I found him on his porch, sipping a cup of tea as if he'd been expecting me. His eyes, sharp and piercing despite his age, met mine as I approached. "You stayed longer than I thought you would," he said, setting the cup down. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's in that house?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the question was too much to bear. "It's not the house itself," he said. "It's what was brought into it." I sat down on the porch steps, my hands clenched into fists. "Tell me." The man hesitated, then began to speak in a low, grave voice. "Edward Ashford wasn't just a recluse," he said. "He was obsessed with things no one should be. He believed the house was a gateway, a place where the walls between worlds were thin. He spent years performing rituals, trying to open the door to something. What did he bring through?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The old man shook his head. "No one knows for sure. But whatever it was, it consumed him. The last time anyone saw him, he was raving about shadows and voices, claiming they'd followed him into his dreams. And then he disappeared. The police found blood in the house, but no body. Just traces of him." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Why hasn't anyone torn the place down?" He gave a bitter laugh. "You think it would stop? It's not just the house. It's the land, the air, the foundation itself. Whatever he did, he made it permanent." I looked down at my wrist, at the faint, glowing mark that refused to fade. "It's following me," I whispered. The old man nodded. "It won't let you go." "Not completely." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum, faint but insistent, seemed to echo in my ears even though I was miles away from the house. "What do I do?" I finally asked. He met my eyes, his expression grim. "You survive," he said. "And you pray that it doesn't decide it wants more." I left the old man's house feeling even more lost than before. The world seemed brighter, harsher, as if the sun itself was mocking my fear. But as I climbed back into my car, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. In the rearview mirror, I saw the shadow of something sitting in the back seat. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the dim light filtering through the car. But it was there, a shape, a presence, watching me with silent, unblinking eyes. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. Instead, I gripped the steering wheel and started the car, my hands trembling as the engine roared to life. I knew then that I couldn't outrun it. Whatever Edward Ashford had unleashed, whatever had marked me, it was with me now, and it wasn't going to let go. I couldn't stay in the motel any longer, no matter how much I dreaded returning to the house. It wasn't just the expense, it was the feeling of being watched, followed. Even in broad daylight, with cars whizzing past and people going about their lives, the mark on my wrist pulsed faintly, as if it had its own heartbeat. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the house, I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the sagging porch and the cracked windows. It looked so ordinary in the daylight, just another aging structure in need of repairs. But I knew better. The house wasn't just a place. It was alive. I stepped inside, bracing myself for the familiar hum. But this time it wasn't just in my ears. It was in my chest, my bones, vibrating through me as if the house were tuning me to its frequency. The air was colder than I remembered, sharp and biting even though it was still early autumn. The faint scent of rot lingered in the corners, mingling with the stale, musty odor of the old wood. I locked the door behind me, an act of futility I knew, and stood in the hallway unsure of where to go. The journal was still upstairs, hidden beneath my pillow. But the thought of reading more of Edward Ashford's words made my skin crawl. Instead, I wandered into the living room, drawn by a faint sound I couldn't quite place. It was a whisper, soft and insistent, like the murmur of wind through leaves. But there was no breeze here, no trees outside to rustle. The sound grew louder as I approached the far wall. My hand trembled as I reached out, brushing my fingers against the peeling wallpaper. The whispering stopped. And then, as if in response to my touch, the wallpaper began to ripple. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the surface of the wall seemed to shift and move. The symbols beneath the paper glowed faintly, their intricate lines twisting and writhing like living things. A voice, low and guttural, rumbled through the room. It wasn't a single voice, but many, overlapping and echoing as if they were all speaking at once. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. Asterisk. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw faces in the wall, distorted, screaming faces, their mouths wide in silent agony. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. I found myself in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I tried to catch my breath. My head throbbed and the mark on my wrist burned like fire. I needed to leave. But something was keeping me here, an invisible force that held me in place. My body was trembling, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from one side of the house to the other. My throat tightened as I realized the steps were heading toward the staircase. Toward me. I grabbed a knife from the counter, a ridiculous weapon I knew, but it was all I had. The footsteps grew louder, each creak of the floorboard sending a jolt of terror through me. The shadow appeared first, long and distorted, stretching across the hallway as something descended the stairs. I couldn't breathe, and then it stepped into view. It wasn't Edward Ashford. It wasn't anything human. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its body cloaked in shadow that seemed to writhe and pulse like smoke. Its face, or what passed for one, was a void, a featureless expanse of darkness that seemed to draw the light from the room. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then it moved. The kitchen lights flickered as the figure surged forward, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. I screamed, raising the knife, but the blade passed through it as if it were nothing more than air. The figure didn't stop. It was inside me before I could even react, a cold, suffocating presence that filled my chest and stole the air from my lungs. My vision swam, and the room tilted around me as I collapsed to the floor. For a moment, there was only darkness. And then I heard the whisper again, faint and distant, as if coming from inside my own head. Asterisk, you belong to us now. Asterisk. I woke hours later, sprawled on the cold kitchen floor. The knife was still in my hand, but the blade was clean, untouched. The figure was gone, but the mark on my wrist had grown darker, spreading up my arm like black veins. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. The house was silent now, the oppressive hum replaced by an eerie stillness that was somehow worse. I knew I couldn't stay here. But as I reached for the door, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The symbols weren't just on my wrist anymore. They were on the walls, the floors, even the windows, etched into every surface like a dark, pulsing scar. The house wasn't just haunted, it was infected. And so was I. The house no longer felt like a structure of wood and stone. It felt alive, sentient, and I was its prisoner. The faint symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly in the dim light, their pulsating rhythm syncing eerily with my heartbeat. I couldn't look away no matter how much they unnerved me. The mark on my wrist itched like a festering wound. No amount of scratching would ease it. It wasn't just an itch, it was a presence, a creeping sensation that felt like the house itself was inside me, spreading through my veins. I stumbled into the bathroom, clutching my arm. The fluorescent light flickered weakly above the cracked mirror, casting distorted reflections that made the small space feel like a funhouse of horrors. I turned on the faucet and splashed water onto my face, desperate to calm the rising panic. But when I glanced at the mirror, my breath caught. The reflection wasn't mine. It was me, but not me. My eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark, bruise-like hollows. My skin looked pale, almost translucent, and the veins beneath it were black, spidering up from the mark on my wrist. And then it smiled. I didn't. The thing in the mirror smiled at me, a slow, unnatural curl of the lips that sent a chill racing down my spine. I screamed and backed away, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. I fell hard onto the tile floor, the air rushing out of my lungs. When I looked up again, the reflection was normal, or as normal as it could be under the circumstances. I scrambled to my feet and fled the bathroom, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, but every time I reached for the door, something stopped me. It wasn't a physical barrier, it was something deeper, a gnawing sense of dread that told me leaving wouldn't save me. Instead, I found myself drawn to the upstairs bedroom where I had hidden Edward Ashford's journal. The air grew heavier with each step I took, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. By the time I reached the bedroom door, I was gasping for breath. The journal was exactly where I had left it, tucked beneath the pillow on the bed. The pages felt rough and brittle under my fingers, their edges stained with age and something darker. I flipped to the next entry, my hands trembling as I read. Asterisk, the house has claimed me. I thought I could control it, bend it to my will, but I was a fool. The rituals, the sacrifices, they were never for me. They were for it. The door I opened cannot be closed. I am its servant now, its vessel. And soon so will you. Asterisk. The words blurred before my eyes as a low, guttural growl resonated through the room. I turned slowly, the journal slipping from my hands and landing on the floor with a dull thud. The closet door, which I knew I had left open, was now shut, and something was knocking from the inside. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed by a cold, suffocating fear. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, shaking the thin wooden door on its hinges. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was only silence. And then a voice. It wasn't human. It was deep, raspy, and filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, let me out. Asterisk. The doorknob began to turn, the metal creaking as if it hadn't been used in years. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The door swung open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness. It wasn't the darkness of a poorly lit closet. It was a void, an absence of light that seemed to swallow everything around it. And then it stepped out. The figure was taller than any human, its body cloaked in shadow that writhed and twisted like smoke. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were glowing pinpricks of red, burning with an intensity that felt like they could see straight through me. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My knees buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, unable to tear my gaze away. The figure extended a hand, its long, claw-like fingers reaching for me. The mark on my wrist burned with searing pain, the black veins spreading further up my arm and across my chest. I screamed as the pain consumed me, my vision going white. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the bedroom, drenched in sweat. The figure was gone, but the mark on my wrist had changed. It was no longer a single symbol. It had spread, intricate patterns crawling across my skin like a dark, sinister tattoo. The journal lay open beside me, the pages blank except for a single line scrawled in blood-red ink. Asterisk, you are the house now. Asterisk. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. The house was silent, but it no longer felt empty. It was inside me and I was inside it. There was no escape. I didn't leave the bedroom right away. I couldn't. The mark on my wrist pulsed like a second heartbeat, each throb echoing through my entire body. I felt tethered to the house, as though invisible chains held me to this place of horrors. I stared at the journal, at the blood-red words written across its once blank pages. You are the house now. The meaning sank into me slowly, like a poison creeping through my veins. I could feel the house breathing, its presence seeping into my skin. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. It was alive. I left the journal on the floor, too afraid to touch it again. My mind raced, searching for a plan, a solution, anything that could sever this growing connection between me and the cursed walls around me. But deep down, I knew there was no easy answer. I made my way downstairs, my footsteps hesitant and slow. The house seemed darker now, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls and floors. Every corner felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to falter. The kitchen was colder than usual, the chill biting into my skin even as I wrapped my arms around myself. I opened the refrigerator out of habit, seeking some distraction, but the contents were spoiled. Milk curdled, vegetables rotted, meat discolored. It had all been fine yesterday. That's when I noticed it. The condensation on the refrigerator door had formed into words, scrawled as though by an unseen hand. Asterisk, feed it. Asterisk. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair in my panic. The words were clear, deliberate, and they disappeared as quickly as they had formed, fading into nothingness. The house wanted something. It wanted me to give it life. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my trembling hands. I thought of the previous tenants, of the vague warnings from the neighbor who had hinted at the house's cursed history. Had they experienced this too? Had they fed it? My mind wandered to Edward Ashford, the occultist who had lived here before me. His rituals, his sacrifices, they weren't random. They were deliberate acts of devotion to the entity bound to this house. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what feeding it might mean. I bolted the kitchen door and ran upstairs to the attic. I hadn't been up there since the day I moved in. The pull of the house was stronger here, the air thick and oppressive. It smelled of mildew and something acrid like burnt hair. I found an old trunk shoved into the corner, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. It didn't feel like something left behind by accident. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside were relics of Edward's life, candles burnt to their stubs, a ceremonial dagger, and a photograph of him standing in front of the house. But what caught my attention most was a leather-bound book wrapped in a black cloth. I unwrapped it carefully, the cloth disintegrating into dust at my touch. The book was heavier than it looked, its cover embossed with strange symbols. I opened it to the first page, the text written in a language I couldn't understand. But the drawings were unmistakable. They depicted rituals, people bound in circles of fire, and shadowy figures reaching out with elongated hands. The final pages were smeared with ink, or blood, but a single word stood out, scrawled in desperate, jagged letters. Sacrifice. Night fell quickly, as though the house had sped up the descent of darkness. The air was colder than ever, and I found myself lighting every candle I could find. But no amount of light could chase away the shadows. They were alive, writhing along the walls and ceilings like serpents. The mark on my wrist burned again, the pain radiating through my body. I doubled over, gasping for breath as whispers filled the air. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, overlapping until they became an unbearable cacophony. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was insistent, demanding. Stop. I screamed, clutching my head. Leave me alone. The whisper ceased abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk. I collapsed to my knees, tears streaming down my face. The house was no longer a place. It was a prison, a living, breathing thing that had claimed me as its own. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke in the living room, sprawled across the floor. My wrist throbbed with fresh pain, and when I looked down, I saw that the mark had changed again. The intricate patterns had grown, spreading across my forearm and up to my shoulder. They looked like roots, black and gnarled, digging into my flesh. The room was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made my ears ring. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They came from the hallway, slow and deliberate. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the living room door. The doorknob turned. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. And then it stepped through. It wasn't the shadowy figure from before. This was something worse. Its form was barely human, its body twisted and contorted as though it had been broken and pieced back together. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It reached out a hand, and I felt the mark on my arm sear with pain. You belong to us now, it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. I backed away, but the room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in. There was no escape. The thing lunged, and I screamed as its hand closed around my wrist. The pain was blinding, searing through my body like fire. And then everything went black. When I woke, the world was wrong. The air was heavy, oppressive, and thick with an almost tangible weight. I was no longer in my living room. The walls around me were pulsing faintly, like the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat. They weren't walls at all anymore. They were flesh. I scrambled to my feet, my hands pressing against the grotesque surface. It was warm, damp, and it shifted beneath my touch as though alive. Panic gripped me, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I called out into the darkness, but my voice was swallowed immediately, the sound muffled as if the air itself didn't want me to be heard. The mark on my arm burned, the lines now branching out like veins snaking across my chest and neck. I could feel it pulsing in time with the walls, as if I were somehow connected to this monstrous place. The memories came flooding back. The shadowed figure, the grotesque creature, its hand gripping my wrist like a brand. You belong to us now. I staggered forward, my feet squelching against the floor, which was slick and yielding like raw flesh. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and putrid like blood and decay. Somehow, I knew I wasn't in the house anymore. Or rather, I wasn't in the house as I knew it. This was something deeper, something hidden, the true heart of the house. As I walked, the space around me seemed to shift and warp. Hallways stretched endlessly, only to twist into impossible angles. Doors appeared and disappeared, some opening to reveal black voids, others filled with grotesque visions. Faces pressed against the fleshy walls, mouths silently screaming. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with every step I took. They overlapped, an incomprehensible chorus of agony and malice. I tried to focus, to find some semblance of direction, but the shifting corridors made it impossible. It felt like I was walking in circles, though I was certain I had never been in the same place twice. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, its back turned to me. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and distorted. It didn't move, but I could feel its awareness, its gaze piercing through me even though it wasn't facing me. I stopped, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would hear. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice cracked with fear. The figure turned slowly, its movements unnaturally smooth, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Its face was featureless, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, pale surface. But I knew it could see me. It raised one long, skeletal hand and pointed down the hallway behind it. The mark on my arm flared with pain, as though urging me to obey. I didn't want to move closer. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but there was nowhere else to go. I took a step forward, then another. The figure remained still, its hand unwavering. When I was just a few feet away, it lowered its arm and stepped aside, revealing a door that hadn't been there before. The door was different from the others I had seen. It was made of wood, its surface carved with intricate symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The mark on my arm pulsed in approval, urging me onward. I opened the door. The room beyond was massive, impossibly large for the house, or whatever this place was. The walls and floor were the same grotesque, fleshy texture, but the air here was colder, almost freezing. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it sat an object wrapped in black cloth. The whispers grew deafening as I stepped inside, the air vibrating with their intensity. I approached the pedestal cautiously, every nerve in my body on edge. When I was close enough, I reached out and unwrapped the cloth, revealing what lay beneath. It was a mirror. The glass was cracked, its surface warped and stained, but I could see my reflection. Or at least I thought it was my reflection. The figure in the mirror was me, but it wasn't. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. The mark on its arm was fully formed, the black veins spreading across its entire body. I stumbled back, but the reflection didn't move. It stared at me, its hollow eyes filled with something I couldn't name, despair, hatred, hunger. And then it smiled. The glass of the mirror rippled like water, and before I could react, the reflection reached through. Its hand closed around my wrist, the mark burning hotter than ever before. I screamed, pulling back, but its grip was unyielding. "You took my place," it whispered, its voice hollow and echoing. "Now it's yours." The mirror shattered, and the world around me exploded into darkness. When I woke again, I was in my bed. The room was silent, the air still. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I looked at my arm. The mark was gone, but my skin was pale and thin, the veins beneath black and branching out like roots. I stood and looked around the room. It was my house, but it wasn't. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and froze. The reflection wasn't me. It was the figure from the mirror, its hollow eyes staring back at me with that same twisted smile. I reached out to touch the glass, and the reflection moved with me, but it didn't feel like a reflection anymore. The house was alive, and I was its prisoner. The days blurred together after that. Or were they nights? Time didn't seem to work the same way anymore. My house was no longer just a house. It had become a living, breathing entity, and I was trapped inside it. The walls would sigh and groan, their fleshy surfaces expanding and contracting like lungs. Shadows twisted and danced, even when there was no light to cast them. Sometimes I would hear laughter, deep, guttural, and mocking, echoing from somewhere deep within. I tried to leave. Oh, how I tried. The front door was there, right where it always had been, but no matter how hard I pulled or how loud I screamed, it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were useless. They showed the world outside, but it was always distorted, like looking through a layer of thick, rippling water. My phone had long since stopped working. No signal. No internet. Nothing. I was alone. The first week, or was it a month? I thought I might go insane. The house didn't let me sleep, not really. Whenever I closed my eyes, I would feel it watching me, hear it whispering my name. Sometimes I would wake to find myself standing in a different room, my hands stained with something dark and sticky. What? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I found the journal again, or maybe it found me. It was lying on the dining table one morning, its cover open to a page I didn't remember reading. Asterisk, the house demands a tenant. Keeper. A sacrifice, asterisk. The words were scrawled messily as though written in a frenzy. Beneath them was a diagram of the house, its rooms connected by lines and symbols that made my head ache to look at. The house wasn't just a house. It was a vessel, a gateway. The rituals performed by its original owner had opened a door to something ancient, something hungry. And now that something had claimed me. I slammed the journal shut and threw it across the room, but when I turned away, it was back on the table, open to the same page. There was no escaping it. The encounters became more vivid, more real. At night, I would hear footsteps outside my bedroom door, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Sometimes the door would creak open, and I would see the shadow of something standing just out of sight, its breath loud and raspy. One night, I felt it sit on the edge of my bed. The mattress sank beneath its weight, and the air grew icy cold. I didn't dare move. Why me? I whispered, my voice trembling. For a long moment there was silence. Then it answered, its voice low and guttural. You let us in. I closed my eyes trying to block it out, but the weight remained. When I finally opened them again, the room was empty, though the mark on my arm, now barely visible, throbbed faintly. Desperation drove me to search the house again, every corner, every crevice, looking for some way to break free. In the attic, I found something new, a trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. It was small and covered in dust, as though it hadn't been touched in decades. My heart pounded as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, but I had no choice. If there was even the slightest chance of escape, I had to take it. The staircase was damp and narrow, the air thick with the stench of rot. My footsteps echoed as I descended, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive dark. At the bottom I found a small room. It was circular, its walls covered in the same symbols I had seen in the journal. In the center was a stone altar, and on it lay another mirror. This one was pristine, its surface smooth and untouched. I stepped closer, my reflection coming into view. It was me, or at least it looked like me. But as I stared, the image shifted. The reflection smiled, though I hadn't. Its eyes were hollow, its teeth sharp. It raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. Take my place, it whispered. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, I won't. The reflection's smile widened. You already have. The glass rippled and the figure stepped out. It towered over me, its form twisting and shifting, its features becoming grotesque and monstrous. I turned to run, but the room had changed. The staircase was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The creature lunged, its hand closing around my throat. I screamed, but no sound came out. The air around me seemed to thicken, pulling me down, suffocating me. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was standing outside the house. The air was crisp and cool, the morning sun shining down on me. For a moment, I thought I was free. But then I looked down at my hands. They were pale and thin, the veins black and branching out like roots. The mark on my arm was gone, but I could feel it deep inside, pulsing faintly. The house loomed behind me, silent and still, its windows dark. A car pulled up to the curb and a young couple stepped out, their faces bright with excitement. We're finally here, the woman said, her voice cheerful. Our new home. I wanted to warn them, to scream at them to run, but I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't move, my voice wouldn't come. As they walked toward the front door, I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing hollowly on the empty street. I didn't look back, but I could still feel it watching me, waiting. I don't know where I'll go now, but one thing is certain. The house isn't done. Not with me. Not with any of us.